Oh, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the meeting this evening. Firstly, I will ask the Democratic Services Officer to read out the housekeeping notice.
Thank you. Please note this meeting is being recorded by the Council for live broadcast and will be published on the website for a minimum of 6 months. The meeting may also be recorded or streamed for live or subsequent broadcast by members of the public, although ultimate discretion in this matter lies with the Chair in case of disruption. For those in the room, please note that if the fire alarm sounds, please exit the building by way of the nearest available signed fire exit route and make your way to the assembly point at the front of this building in the car park. Finally, please ensure background noise is kept to a minimum and mobile phones and other devices are turned off or switched to silent for the duration of the meeting. For those in the room, this includes turning off microphones and the volume down completely on laptops. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we have any apologies or substitutes?
So we've received apologies from Councillor Stephen Bartlett and Lindy Jansen van Vuren. I note Councillor Vicky Slate has also advised that she'll be arriving late. Substitute members, we haven't got any today.
Thank you very much. Declaration of interest. Do any councillors have any disclosable pecuniary interests or any other interests on any items of the agenda? We already discussed this to some extent at the previous meeting, but if anyone wanted to add anything, please feel free. Okay, confirmation of minutes. Before I go on, you might notice my voice is a little croakier than usual. I can only apologise. I've been unwell with some sort of respiratory infection. I'm sure I'm better, but it's left my voice a little bit hoarse and coughing. So apologies if it runs out at some point and I have to ask someone to take over. Right, item number 4, confirmation of minutes. Thank you for circulating the minutes of the last meeting. I think it's difficult when it's such a long meeting, but I'm satisfied with the minutes as drafted. Do we have any comments anyone wanted to raise on the minutes? Or do we have a mover? Thank you, Councillor Tarling, and a seconder. Thank you, Councillor Andrews. Are we happy to agree the minutes with consensus? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Right, public issues. Do we have any public questions, statements, or petitions that have been submitted in relation to the agenda item?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we'll deal with public questions first. We have 5 public questions. There are 3 questions from Mr. Ian Redman, which Mr. McKinstry is going to read on his behalf, followed by 2 questions from Mr. McKinstry.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Mr. McKinstry. Go ahead when you're ready.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Redmond's questions first of all then. BEIS, Department of Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy, said the council had discretion on how to award additional restrictions grants, but these funds were to be used to support businesses severely impacted by coronavirus restrictions and the rise of the Omicron variant, which Future Places, as a new company, was definitely not. Future Places was urged to apply for a £100,000 additional restrictions grant by the BCP City Panel. Who were the members of this City Panel and which council officers approved the grant?
Thank you. The criteria for latter elements of the ARG grant, schemes 3 and 4, could fit wider criteria as set out in the government guidance. Point 1 on page 4. This guidance is intended to support local authorities in administering the additional restrictions grant to provide direct business grants and wider business support. Point 21 on page 5. With the exception of the third top-up element payment, local authorities can use ARG funding for business support activities. This may primarily take the form of discretionary grants, but local authorities could also use this funding for wider business support activities. And point 34 on page 8. Previous guidance for the additional restrictions grant indicated that businesses must have been trading before relevant restrictions were introduced in order to be eligible. This is no longer the case. All businesses that are trading and meet other eligibility criteria may apply to receive funding under this scheme. There is no starting date from which businesses must have been trading in order to qualify for grant funding. So those were all quotes from the government guidance linked in the statement, in the response. This was all set out in the council's published schemes, which were all approved by Corporate Management Board. Entities who were involved in the City Panel are shown in the SNP at section 5.10.2 of the report. The BCP council leader and deputy leader were also invited. Officers who approved the grant on the council's award panel were the Director of Development and Director of Destination and Culture. supported by 2 officers from Economic Development who were advisors to the panel.
Okay, thank you for that. Second question from Mr. Redman. Once awarded to Future Places, the £100,000 grant was transferred to a separate company, 1HQ Limited, so it could carry out a city identity study. The resulting report by 1HQ is available online and consists of 35 pages, 15 of which are photographs of Bournemouth or full-sized page numbers. The observations in the report aren't particularly striking either. Whose job was it at Future Places or BCP Council to ensure quality control and value for money, especially in this scenario where £100,000 worth of work had supposedly been undertaken?
Thank you. As with all the ARG grants, the responsibility for delivering the outcomes and outputs stipulated in application forms was with the applicant, in this case, Future Places. Future Places were also required to provide a monitoring report detailing how the outcomes and outputs were delivered. All reports needed to be sent to the Council's Economic Development team as part of the grant conditions. The monitoring report for this grant was received.
Third question from Mr. Redman. The timeline mentions several whistleblowing reports from the executives at Future Places, but none from council officers. Were any concerns raised by council officers about Future Places, such as vast sums being allocated to the company? Total project cost for the Poole Civic Centre alone was estimated at £51.8 million. Cost of projects not taken forward having to be written off. Providing a loan that had no hope of being repaid per the external audit report, etc. If yes, when were these concerns raised? What exactly were they, and what action was taken? Concerns about the Bayside restaurant were raised at the outset by council officers, but they were ignored by management.
Thank you. Various concerns were raised by council officers. The report identifies a number of these concerns, for example, those highlighted at section 3.2.20 and 3.5.9. The concerns were voiced to the shareholder representative, and it was agreed that a review after the local elections to align the council's corporate strategy, the council's commissioning plan for Future Places Limited, and the Future Places Limited business plan was required.
Okay, I'll get to 2 questions of my own. Can you confirm the date of the email in paragraph 3114 is without doubt the 2nd of June 2021? This seems remarkably early. Amongst other things, the email, reproduced in full on page 185, describes a decision made the previous Friday to appoint a named individual to the managing director role. The previous Friday would have been the 28th of May, at which point the managing director-to-be had been working for the council for a matter of days. Her earliest expense claim was the 18th of May. Actually, it was the 19th of May, so I got that wrong. Can you double-check the date, therefore?
The email referenced at paragraph 3.1.14 is without doubt dated Wednesday, the 2nd of June 2021, time-stamped 11:40 a.m.
Okay, thank you for that. And where exactly does the quote come from in paragraph 623, informally defining the role of the shareholder representative?
The quote at 6.2.3 is the judgment of the investigator, based on all the evidence gathered, including from parties involved in the investigation. Thank you. Moving on now to public statements.
So for public statements, we have 2 statements from Mr. Redman to be read by Mr. McKinstry, 3 statements from Mr. McKinstry, 1 statement from Mr. Sofianos, which will be read by Democratic Services.
Okay, Mr. Redman's first statement. Councils should not benefit from additional restrictions grants per BEIS and ARG guidance. Section 26 of ARG guidance says all funding provided under this scheme should provide direct support to businesses. The £100,000 grant to Future Places, paid to 1HQ for a placemaking study, must have breached these guidelines. The Future Places Managing Director said in the progress report the grant met two core objectives, quote, to articulate for BCP Council a fresh and distinctive narrative, unquote, and identifying place values for the URC. The award panel similarly said it could be significantly beneficial to BCP and aligns with the aims and objectives of the new economic development strategy and big plan. The beneficiaries of this project were clearly the council and its urban regeneration company, and this should be reported as a misuse of public funds under the Local Government Finance Act. Mr. Redmond's second statement, the Future Places report overlooks many questions from residents, page 164 onwards. One key element missing from the report, who introduced Gail Mayhew to the council? Were procurement rules and financial regulations followed? Who signed the purchase order for her initial consultancy services? And whether alternative quotes were sought? Other outstanding questions include the loan agreement, whether it was right for the CFO to allow it, given the significant risk of default, the shareholder role, whether the CEO failed to put robust scrutiny in place, and why Grant Thornton never raised the alarm until it was too late. A major concern is why the council's leadership didn't commission this investigation when it was first suggested at council in November 2023. Memories were still fresh, documents locatable, and councillors and officers still around to be held accountable. This report is 2 years late.
Can I jump in there, Mr. McKinstry? I want to read out a point of clarification in relation to that statement. The council wishes to clarify matters that it considers to be misleading in Mr. Redmond's statement number 2. The loan agreement was agreed by Cabinet and then Council. The CFO's role was to highlight the financial implications and risk which are set out in the report. It was not the role or responsibility of Grant Thornton to raise the alarm on matters pertaining to specific council decisions. Grant Thornton raised concerns from a wider governance perspective in their annual value for money opinion at the earliest opportunity with regard to Future Places Limited. Thank you. Please carry on.
OK, I've got 3 statements of my own then, Councillor Connolly. First of which, it's disgraceful that a £100,000 COVID support grant was used to fund a city identity study. 35 pages, half of which were illustrations. But look closer. The application and financial waivers state Future Places was requested to apply for this grant by the BCP City panel. Also on this panel was the Suter Group, CEUTA, whose subsidiary, Suter Secretaries Limited, was secretary to 1HQ Limited, the company that did the study and was indeed sole bidder for this £100,000 project. They shared the same registered office and the same director. Other panel members included Bourne Asset Management Limited, whose director went on to become de facto Future Places landlord, and a great many concerns from residents about that particular matter are cited on page 169. The council's dealings with this city panel need examining, as several threads of Drew Mellor's administration were intertwined with it. Second statement, paragraph 5310 et sequentes considers the stewardship initiative, seemingly an unincorporated business of which the Future Places MD was co-founder. This connection wasn't mentioned in the 2021 business plan, which is publicly available, incidentally, or at any council meeting, despite the initiative gaining potential kudos from the stewardship kite mark, which would be applied to Future Places projects. This should have been put front and centre by administration politicians. Likewise, the arrangement at 5314, whereby 1% of property sales on Future Places sites would be paid into a stewardship fund. That detail was buried in the appendix to an exempt document. The 2 co-founders of the Stewardship Initiative had senior posts in companies awarded £187,000 by Future Places, and doubtless the committee will examine whether overlapping interests were declared, to what effect, and what Chinese walls were in place. Third statement, reserved matter 39 of the shareholders' agreement restricted approval of any bonus, profit sharing or share option scheme to council. And this was serious stuff, as a share option scheme would have removed the company's TECL status. Of course, this matter should have been referred to full council, therefore. Ditto reserved matter 40, the actual bonus payments, given the size of the payments, concerns about the company's underperformance, with business cases delayed, plus other controversies. Indeed, I doubt whether the 2023 bonuses would have passed full council, given the changed administration. The shareholder representative, who had no voting rights, sitting mutely at related board meetings, was no substitute for the full council endorsement that these matters surely warranted. The committee should therefore reject paragraph 519 and find that the shareholders' agreement was breached in reserved matters 39 and 40.
Thank you very much. We have one more, don't we?
Thank you. Yep, finally, a statement from Mr. Adam Sofianos. Ever since the creation of Future Places, the project has been scrutinised and criticised by local residents. That criticism has been entirely validated. But history should also note how people connected to Future Places tried to deflect and deter this scrutiny. In a 2023 council meeting, then leader Phil Broadhead controversially dismissed residents asking questions about Future Places as election candidates. Earlier in a 2022 committee session, one of his councillors condemned public criticism as hearsay, misinformation and fake news, while the Future Places managing director complained about kangaroo court commentary. Yet scrutiny was and remains utterly justified. And now, as councillors contemplate what to do next, a critical question must be answered. What actions will this council take to ensure that something as damaging as Future Places can never happen again? Only when that objective has been met can council look those residents in the eye and tell them the case is closed.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on to item 6. This is the investigation report, scope item 128. So I think we should see this just a bit of, by way of opening remarks, I think we should see this as a continuation of the last meeting, where we continue to go through the report. Now we have the rest of the report, and we can keep going through it in the manner we did, identifying where we would like clarification, making a note of where we might want to look further as we go through. Now I think we should try and go through at pace, but realistically, based on the last meeting, and to do justice to the depth of the report and the work that's gone into it, I don't think we should rush it. So I am anticipating that we'll need at least one more meeting, which I hope to take place early December. I think we're going to suggest a date, potentially the 3rd of December, but we can confirm that after the meeting by email to look at your availability. But I would like to have that 3rd meeting at which we'll continue what we don't get through tonight, and that is the meeting at which we will take some decisions about what we want to do next, if we want further information, how to get it, etc. So for today, I propose we just continue going through the report, making sure we understand it, asking questions and making notes for potential next steps. With that in mind, I sent an email to committee members suggesting that as part of that, they might like to send to me and to Mr. Stannard any questions that we haven't already discussed in the meetings that you think should be explored further. And what I'll do is I'll compile those together into a list which we can then discuss and we'll have in front of us to facilitate the discussion at that next meeting. So this is to encourage members to make a note of anything that they think they would like us to discuss looking at further between now and the next meeting. So with that in mind, Mr. Stannard, would you like to make any comments on the report? And now you've published the whole thing. If you'd like to pass, that's fine as well. And can I just say thank you very much for the thoroughness and the detail and the amount of work it must have taken. So thank you very much for that on behalf of all of us, I'm sure. If you wanted to make any comments, please do feel free. No need to.
I won't make any comments. I'll let you ask questions as you see fit.
Okay, unless anybody else wanted to make any comments, shall we begin at section 4? Right, so I have this as page 57, section 4, detailed expenditure incurred by BCP Future Places Limited. Now, I note that we had a briefing as committee members on how to understand the finances of it, and so some things have. Oh, sorry, Mr. Sanders.
Can I suggest we just clarify whether we're going to use my numbering 57 of 190 or we're going to use the big numbers, because I know a couple of members have already just struggled to find that. So it's 57 of 190 or 79 of the pack. 79 is the big number.
Yes,
We
of
do the
course.
pack numbers.
I thought I was doing the one that I did the wrong one last time. I thought I was doing that one this time. To get it wrong both ways. But either way, it's start of section 4. So today we're tackling the finances, beginning of the finances section. So we did have an opportunity already to kind of make sure that we understand how to read the finances. But let's go through them section at a time. So 4.1, provide details of where the money went, what expenditure did BCP Future Places Limited incur, and a schedule. I note the first recommendation you make is about tackle companies should be filed to Companies House. And I think it's important to be clear that this was not a failure on their part. It's not something that they were required to do. So there's no suggestion there of a lack of transparency, but this is a recommendation in future. It would be advisable to ensure that tackle companies would be filed to Companies House. Now, did any members want to come in on this first item, 4.1? If nothing else to get us going, let's just clarify then. So the total expenditure of Future Places was 7.2 million. It received 4.7 million in income from the council. So that is money paid by the council for receipt of business cases provided. So that is services provided by Future Places that were purchased from BCP. That came to 4.7 million figure. The only other income they got from that was the ARG grant, effectively. Is that correct? Is that understanding is the right one? Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, just to help you out, Chair, I mean, some of my questions are fairly sort of minor, because I must admit the report that the first reading through it, there's a lot to go through, but one of the questions or statements made by members of the public was about the AIG grant and the fact that there's a tackle company and whether that's not a breach of either rules. Now, I'll be honest, I don't know that. Did it meet, firstly, the first question is, did it meet the requirements of actually being a tackle company? And as such, does that mean it should not have got an AIG grant? Because it's a question that I'll be honest, I sort of really did want to. For me, it's a fairly minor part of the whole investigation, but it is a key part.
I think you're quite right that it is definitely a key question, even if it is a small figure in the big context. I would point out, though, that this is there is a particular agenda item of the scope on this, which we'll get to the whole section on this, which is section 5.10.
5.10.
Under 5.10. So I think we should discuss it in full when we get to that bit. Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, thanks very much. I know that some of this does come up later anyway, like you just said. But I mean, for me, certainly the ARG grant is despicable, really, that ever happened. It's not the only one, as you know. I actually brought to this committee the issue of £70,000 to a non-existent operation for a lagoon. This is money that was meant for businesses that were in trouble or to support them through COVID. And there may have been discretion allowed, but I think it's absolutely disgusting that this sort of money, £100,000, was put out there for 35 pages, mostly of pictures. It's just absolutely ridiculous. Who allowed it? How did it happen? It should never have happened. It's disgusting. So that's the first one. In my view, that is my opinion. and I'm entitled to that opinion, and that is my opinion. The other thing is the bonuses. Who agreed them? There's been a lot of things brought up by the public tonight, which I think are very, very valid, and that's another one. There seems to be within, I think it's at page 95, there's something about bonuses. I mean, there's so much in here, it's very difficult to sort of drill down on everything. But who actually did agree them? Or was it said somewhere in here, oh, well, it was all done through the proper process? I think that's the way it was put in. Perhaps not the right words. And you might want to come back on that because it is another part of here. I've had a look at it, but you just can't take it all in and you can't write it all down again. So I think there's a big issue there with bonuses. And just looking at this, at the amount of employees that they actually had, I mean, it goes all the way down here to employee R. What were all these people doing? Or were these people that were employed by BCP or something and subcontracted, or were they actually on the payroll of Future Places? And what were they all doing? I'd like to know that, actually. It's just diabolical, a lot of this. And I've said before at a previous meeting about is it 3 million or something or other, or more than that, spent on consultants. What were we paying these people for if they were just employing others to do the job for them? I'm quite shocked about the whole thing. That's just my comment on this section, although I know some of it is dealt with later on. Thank you.
Very much agree, and I think we're going to go into each of those areas in some detail. That's my hope. I completely agree with you, Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. It's just to pick up on your point, Councillor Tarling, with regards to TECL status, because I know that was a big question that I had at our last session, that I'm not sure, well, actually, I don't believe it's been really established whether we, as a council, whether we adhered to the specific conditions of that status. And I think this question in relation to the ARG funding, I think, again, absolutely shocked that that funding was handed over and that it was overspent by, what was it, £28,000, that there was an overspend on that as well. I'd like to know how that report was beneficial, who made that decision, how was that grant funding allocated, and what the consequences of that would be. I've got lots of other comments to make with regards to this section, so I will make those as we go through the discussion. Thank you.
No, appreciated. Thank you, Councillor Andrews.
Thank you for that. I'm looking at that list of consultancy fees, which is on page 58 and page 59. I should point out to anybody who's actually going through that in detail, the fifth one from the top on page 59, which is called Future Places Studio, is nothing to do with Future Places. It was just a coincidence that they have a similar name. But my question is, and we may not have the answer to this, I know when councils, public utilities go out to get consultants to give them advice, they do a tendering process. You know, they obviously, it's got to be a reputable firm, and perhaps you may necessarily take the cheapest. But my query is whether Future Places did, with all this money, and we're talking about over £3 million worth of consultancy fees, actually readily went out and did some competitive tendering with all these people, or whether they regularly went back to their favourite architect, surveyor or designer, because you know the top one there is £290,500. It's an awful lot of money on consultancy fees, which is quite out of proportion to actually what they actually achieved. Basically, I'm not aware they actually constructed any residential dwellings whatsoever.
Thank you all. So I'm looking at paragraph 4.1.5 on the top of page 80. And so this drills down the total expenditure figure of 7.2 million. And my takeaway is a huge amount of consultancy fees. So there's 40% of all expenditures on consultancy fees. And remember that the purpose of setting up this vehicle was to allow for experts to be brought in. Now, I am not an expert myself, and so I think a reasonable line of inquiry would be to find out what a comparable amount on consultancy fees is for other companies. what does Bournemouth Development Company spend on consultants? What does other local authorities regeneration departments spend? What does BCP's what's the normal amount? Because I think there are only 17 employees, despite costing 2 million. There are only 17 employees, so you would imagine a fair amount of reliance on contractors for certain pieces of work. But 3.1 million seems a huge amount. So I think one of the questions that I would add to the list for next meeting's discussion is how we can get some understanding of how that compares, and whether that is unusually high. I think that would be a useful thing to do. Now one observation I just want to make on this was one of the reasons we wanted to do this whole investigation is to understand where the money went, where taxpayers' money went. And I think there's two sides to that. So the first side of that is understanding technically, where did the money go? Is there any money that is unexplained? Where is there missing money? Is there anything, anything that we don't understand? Then the second part of it is whether or not the money was well spent. Did we get value for money? So I think it's quite important for us to be clear on this. Do you think that there is any lack of clarity over or questions over where the money actually went? I think we can kind of close that down. I think we can see where it went. It went on consultancy fees, it went on salaries, it went, but I think it's important for us to establish that difference. Does anybody think there's any kind of questions over the finances? Or are we moving on to the second part, which is, did we get value for money? Was that money well spent? What did we get for it? Do you understand the distinction I'm making there? Does anyone want to make any comments on that? Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. It's with regards to, it's in 4.1.6, in this very small print, that it should be noted that this list does not total to the figure above, and there was a manual adjustment of 8,467, for which I can find no working paper. I'm just wondering, Mr. Stannard, if you could shed a bit more light on that, which is part of the question of where's the money gone. And
as an auditor, it's very frustrating when totals don't balance. You can imagine that. And I did spend 2 days trying to balance this to find £8,000, and I thought, I'm being a busy fool here. So I eventually knocked it on the head and said, I can't. So the working paper doesn't exist. So it's just one of those things where I can't tell you, unfortunately.
because seeing that did make me wonder, are there any other examples, in the finances where money hasn't been accounted for or it's gone missing in some way? But for people listening at home, I also want to draw attention to the fact that this is within a list of not only of consultants and people that were outsourced to deliver services, but there are also lists of hotels, of hospitality, of leisure, restaurants. There's a whole range of different providers. So I'm wondering whether, I was left wondering about that £8,500, whether it went on entertainment or leisure or smoozing people and just wasn't accounted for.
So Taryn, did you want to add something to that point?
Yeah, I ought to declare an interest. Actually, one of the companies I'm currently working with at the moment actually managed the contract of that's in the list here. But for me, there isn't actually a conflict here, and they are an expensive company. And when I look down the list here, I think Councillor Andrews, who works in a similar sector than me, will recognise some of these companies as being very well known in the industry on the first page, and thought of as certainly the premier league of design and property consultants. And when we think of the actual properties we were discussing, as in 2 civic centres and some, they didn't warrant that level of expenditure. And I could some of the large ones I actually are probably quite reasonable. Then we get down to, is the Village Hotels there? Is that just a bar bill at £1,440, or is that accommodation stay, or they put on a conference, sales conference? If that was a full, meet the buyer type event, then that's a good value for a hotel, £1,440. Having done a similar one on my current project, that would actually be quite a decent thing. I would say though that when I've worked in this sort of thing and I've done this type of event and used hotels, all this type of thing, we quite often use social enterprise companies as well to do it, because it's amazing what you can get for a lot less money and still plough some money back in. So that's the other bit is it's very commercial for a company that's a tech company that's spending public money. We've gone to some very big names there, and there is the Premier League, AFC Bournemouth in there, but Ove Arup are up there as one of the leading structural architectural companies, as is Atkins, Ramboll. I've worked with Atkins. I'm actually currently working with WSP. I've worked with. They're all, and Hawley again, a very big company, and that isn't a large invoice from them, 52,000. But what did they do for it? You get down to some of the other ones. I mean, I did have Pryor and Partners, the largest one, and I did just have a chuckle and show Councillor Armstrong and said, "Where's the money gone?" I noticed they got a Dubai office, so I don't know if that was the Dubai office we're actually engaging there at that figure, but it did make me chuckle that's what they do. But again, they seem to offer the same service as Future Places do in the entirety. So why are we spending £290,000 with Pryor and Partners when, to be honest, they could have probably done exactly the same thing that Future Places are doing? I ought to declare a second interest that I work for a company not for much longer that offer a similar sort of service, although not on this list here. And I'm not promoting them in any way.
Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, while we're on consultancies, I just want to highlight and ask as well. It's actually page 85 of the pack, and we've got the amounts paid for consultancy to Smart Growth Associates, which was actually the forthcoming managing director at a Future Places company for that person's employment, I believe. And we're talking about value for money here. £900 a day. Ooh, fixed price contract here on the first one, £18,000, and then we're still paying in amongst all that for all the train tickets and accommodation in the Royal Bath Hotel and everything else. And then we've got 44 days on the next one, £900 a day, and then 20 days at £900 a day. Do we know what we got for that? £900 a day, how was that worked out? Who agreed it? Was there any procurement for this, or did they go straight to this company? How did this work out? That's a lot of money. I'd like to have that sort of money. Thank you very much. And what were they doing for it? Thank you.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, it's just following on from what Councillor Phipps is saying. So in total, that was like £76,852. Now, by comparison, I mean, I work in the voluntary sector and I've been self-employed in that sector before, and the amount of detail that you have to provide to another charitable organisation with regards to, your activities and what you're doing and the evidence. I've worked for one particular charity where I had to provide evidence every 15 minutes of what my activities were. So this absolutely blew my mind that this was sufficient to accept as an invoice for this amount of money. So my question would be around, were there purchase orders? Was there some kind of contract, or what was the specification? I've also commissioned services when I was a council officer back in Bournemouth, and we had to get 3 quotes, and we had to have an actual specification that we agreed with a contractor prior to any work going ahead. So I'm really concerned that that level of rigour wasn't in this process. Thank you.
Thank you. All helpful comments. So yeah, moving on to this consultancy fees. We're going to go through each section. So section A, consultancy fees. I would like to add, as one of the things we do, to find out a little bit more about how that figure benchmarks to regeneration generally. but I think it's really quite a lot. And I think if we were going to do some more digging, and we'll have that discussion next week, but I think I would make a case that whether we got value for money for this work would be one of those areas worth further digging. Look, what did we get? What kind of outputs did we get for these? Or did Future Places get for these pieces of work that were commissioned? I think that might be a valuable thing to want to look into. If we're going to get to the bottom of this value for money question, because this is where an awful lot of the expenditure went. So if we want to question that value for money, that for me is an area very much to do so. So I think we can discuss that next week. Maybe not all of them, maybe a selection, maybe some of them. But what the rigor was around ensuring value for money, I think would be useful to know. I have to say one thing that does concern me is the stewardship.
Sorry to interrupt, full flow, but catch you just there. I think there's another aspect of this to take into consideration, because the range of consultancy, to as an entrepreneur myself, so setting up businesses, the range of consultancy suggests to me that there was not sufficient focus on what Future Places needed to do. So it looks more like a scattergun approach. So we've got this big pot of money and we're going to do all of these things. If you were using your own money and you were a startup, you wouldn't do that because you can't afford to, you can't afford the risk. So if you can balance what you're saying to investigate, I think if Mr. Stannard's able to look at the minutes and see if that scattergun is going on rather than a laser focused business strategy, it might be your biggest clue as to why those consultants fees there, in which case you wouldn't see the comparison in another development company.
Oh, that's a really helpful point. Yeah, if we can note that, well, we can note as an action, I think, looking further at consultancy fees and how they compare, and how to understand them. I think that's something we can return to next week. Next meeting. One thing I did want to flag, though, that I was quite concerned is returning to this stewardship initiative, which comes up repeatedly. If you look on the website for the stewardship initiative, there are a number of organisations which are the supporters of it. And I totted up over 600 grand of these contracts were to supporters of the stewardship initiative. And that's a question for me, is I know in the private sector it's usual to do business with your contacts, right? That, you know, companies you know of and work of. But I do query the reliance on a certain organisations where there is a previous relationship and how that was managed. I think that might be something to look at. So yeah, I think for me, consultancy fees and whether or not good value for money and good process was assured throughout that, I think is a very important part of this. Right, should we move on to B, director's salaries and staff salaries? Should we look at them together? Did anyone want to make any comments on those? I take your point about the 900, the consultants fees being very high for the voluntary sector or for the public sector. We talked about this a little bit at the last meeting about how this is exactly the problem where the cultures collide, right, between the private sector, what normal consultancy costs in the private sector compared to what taxpayers expect. I think that brings out that tension hugely. Councillor Armstrong.
I think that may be the case, but ultimately we're talking about accountability here, and that's not really shining through for me at the moment. But the 2 points that I wanted to make with regards to salaries, one is just the eye-wateringness of the salaries, basically for 2 years or less work, and the bonuses and the pensions that are attributed to that. And the other one was the question about the marketing and comms. I just wonder why we didn't go in-house. Why did we pay lots of different companies to deliver that? Why didn't we employ our own staff instead of lots of consultants? Thanks.
Ms. Sanna, did you want to comment on anything raised there from what you've learned?
I can give what I believe to be, in the cold light of day, it all boils down to capacity, and the council's resource doesn't grow on trees. So if you've got a new entity that you've got to deliver communications or whatever support to, you either need more resource to do that, or you've got to choose not to do something else that you're already doing. So that's why it wasn't always practical for future places to purchase whatever they want to purchase from a council service, if a council service existed, such as communications or accountancy or legal, for example.
Would that, I guess that would be difficult without a resource agreement in place. So there wasn't, I think, didn't we not know how much things cost? Wasn't that sorted out until much later?
Correct.
Yeah.
There was a schedule, but not a formal
So I guess
service
that
level
would be
agreement.
difficult. But ultimately, you'd know how much you were going to spend. Future places would know how much it was going to spend on communications and marketing, and it was employing other people through various recruitment processes or none. They could have appointed somebody to take on the communications.
And I think we have to reconcile this with the fact that part of the purpose for setting it up was specifically drawn out as to be able to pay salaries and bonuses and private healthcare to attract the experts that the council can't attract. And I think that was the conscious decision in setting it up. This is the consequence of that, right? And yeah, for those of us used to the public sector, I think that you're going to see that tension there. You asked a question about the decision on the payment of consultants' fees. That's covered in the report, isn't it? The process around agreeing the.
Well, 4.2 in the report. Sorry, thank you. Section 4.2 of my report goes into the commissioning and procurement methodology. It's explained there. And in summary, there's a combination of tendering that you would expect to see in a normal local government context. There was significant use of the Bloom framework, which the council uses as also. And through the Bloom framework, there is it's either a direct award or a mini competition, it's called. So depending on what the particular service being procured. Section 4.2 covers that in more detail if we want to cover that in a few moments.
Did anyone have any more comments on the section on salaries? Subcontractor costs, that's 4.1, 4.9. Councillor Andrews.
Very quick soundbite, I suppose. Yes, the salaries are very high when you look at them, but I would say out in the marketplace, in private companies, MDs and chief operational officers were getting similar monies like that. But what those people, 2 or 3 people at the top of the company were doing an awful lot of the actual work in sorting things out, organising things, and not, as happened here, using consultants to do most of the work for them. From what I can see of the situation, they spent most of their time organising other people to do their work when they should have been having meetings, organising things, and they were paid large salaries. And again, as I said earlier, the end result were minimal.
Yeah, I think the salaries combined with the level of procurement of contracts, that doesn't sit too easily, I think. Looking at advertising and marketing, 4.1.11, advertising marketing, we've already commented on that already. Going down to section G on legal fees, I did have a query, and again, I think I'll put this on the list of things to think about for next week. Knight Frank, Castle Town Law, that's 3 reviews of stewardship model. And I see that you say they may be misclassified, so they might have been consultants. But either way, that stewardship model is that was the heart and soul of Future Places. So why that needed to be, I'd really like to know what that was, because that's 40,000 on reviews of the model on which it was all founded, and I think just understanding what was got for that is something I'll be keen on. And then carry on, Councillor Slade.
Apologies for arriving late, but I was reading the information that the former chief executive sent to us about the stewardship model, and it seems odd to me that she was potentially recruited because of the stewardship model, which the former councillors thought was a great idea, which she had founded. She then claims that this initiative was dormant during the time that she was working for Future Places, but then invested money to review the very model that she claimed was dormant, basically off the taxpayer, which she's now continuing to sell out there. That to the doesn't pass a sniff test to me. It feels to me like the organisation has been used to promote something which is now commercially trying to make money out of. Now, you know, that may not be true, but it's what it looks like. And I think that is really worrying, really worrying.
I'm inclined to agree. I think, especially because Knight Frank is one of the supporters of it as well. And I think we don't know at this stage if there was anything untoward that happened, but all we see is that there was that commercial review was undertaken. We don't know what that was. We don't know what the scope was, what the purpose. And I think that might be something that would be useful to explore and understand. Because as you say, sometimes it's the look of the thing rather than what we know happened. Section H 4.1.13 of the consultant fees, that's been raised already. Now, so it was discussed last time that there was advice specifically to hire on a consultant basis until Future Places was up and running. So that was kind of part of the agreed model. Did anyone have any further questions on that item? Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, I sort of want to make a statement rather than questions, because none of this is a massive surprise to me. It's like we've gone into battle and we've suddenly decided what we need to fight a battle is we're going to take on loads of generals and no soldiers. And so what the generals have done is gone and recruited a load of mercenaries to fight for them. And that's exactly what's happened here, is that we built a company top down, and gone, what we need is a super duper director who, you know, fantastic, you know, or directors, you know, with great CVs. We're going to pay them great money, but then let them not recruit some foot soldiers here, some, you know, some sort of newly qualified RICS property people, you know, from local practices, local hires, you know, recent graduates. You know, where's the structure? We've got this big top heavy organisation, and there's no doers in the business. So what they've done is exactly what the council would have done if we don't have, you know, design consultants or property valuers and so on. And so we go out to the market and we hire a local company to do some asset management surveys, building surveys, that type of thing. And instead of doing it themselves, they've appointed a consultant or a number of consultants to do it. So I think when you've got so many more consultants and number of projects you're working on, you know, it's not unusual to have 3 or 4 consultants, but wouldn't you want to lump them together and take it? Now, I've worked on a similar sort of, I worked on Scape and Crown in the public sector, Crown Commercial Services, where you have a list of certain suppliers that work for you, and you get a buying gain for doing that, and you can then not avoid the Procurement Act, but you can circumvent a lot of the steps of public procurement by using a framework, be it SCAPE or CCF or there's loads of different frameworks, and it looks like this other thing is a similar sort of process, although does it, again, you say, make the sniff test as being independent. So, but it is this fact that they've just, rather than spend money on getting the expertise, development managers and so on board, they've just gone immediately out to the market on it. And whether tendered or not, to be honest, none of the monies there seem unusual to me for the companies concerned. I think we had this discussion. I work in the commercial sector, and those invoices are probably right. But for the size of work they're doing, that's a lot of money. And typically speaking, a construction project, you spend between 8 and 12% on consultants for building something. If we get, we've spent all these millions and we've got nothing. So that's it's almost infinite amount of consultant to actual work done, and that's the bit that's the issue here. I mean, we could drill down into individual bits and pieces, but effectively, the procurement strategy of future places to just go out and spend money, and the value aspect of it seems to have not been. It's not demonstrated here in the report, and the bigger issue for me isn't, we could drill down, isn't any of this, it's the governance. We're an audit and governance, it's the governance that we've got to focus on, because we've just created this behemoth of a company with these fantastic people. We've given them, it's that oversight and governance that we've not had. Sorry? Well, as council, Councillor Slade's just remind me, they, as in, I wasn't a member of the administration at the time, or a member of the council, but we as a council, that's what we did. Thank you.
Mr. Tyler, did you want to come back on that in particular?
Yeah, it's just it is a statement of fact that in the initial committee reports to council cabinet, it was very clearly laid out that the company would grow incrementally, and you can see from just a couple of the tables at 4.16, for example. So for the first financial year, there was 5 employees. For the second financial year, there was 10 employees, and then the third, there was 17. So there was incremental growth, and it was always stated that in the early years of the company, they would rely on consultants to a significant degree. That was stated in committee reports very clearly. So it doesn't really surprise me what I've seen, because it was clearly stated such.
I think that's a helpful point to add. Yes, please, Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Stannard. You probably just reinforced my point. I don't think it's a contrary point. I think, I agree that might have been the strategy, but it hadn't happened. It hadn't been developed enough. And we could make the argument, and I sat on OSB when we first discussed closing down future places in this administration, and you could make the argument that we didn't give it long enough to work out, and we could have realised it. But when you see the direction of travel regarding expenditure, and the S curve of expenditure to what you're getting back for it, and certainly I requested a copy of the Christchurch Civic Centre outline business case, and when you see the costs against it to develop it, certainly, it was not a very good ABC, and I used to write ABCs and FBCs for the Ministry of Defence. I'd have been ashamed to put that in front of anybody, and that was just I would write that with a few subject matter experts working with me, and it was very poor, and it certainly wouldn't have passed at any central government department. If I'd put that in front of a senior civil servant, they'd have gone like, "That's rubbish," and thrown it up, and I'd have been out the door.
Thank you, Councillor Armstrong.
Can we move on to 4.114, the management fees? So my question is, so Mr. Stannard, I know later on in the report it talks about, it refers to sunk costs or sunk fees in relation to accommodation. So for the first 2 years, Future Places was occupying council property but wasn't being charged rent. So looking at these fees, you can see that other services have also got 000 against them. For example, audit in 2 years, HR and payroll, banking and legal and dem services. So was that the same there? Were they receiving those services at no cost? Or were they just not needing those services during that year?
No, Councillor Armstrong. I'll refer to the little difference line below. So that grid that you see there is Future Places' interpretation of what the management fees were. It was not the council's interpretation of what the management fees were in the 3 invoices, i.e. 21, 22, 22, 23, 23, 24, that were presented. And all of those services, I'll pick internal audit because I know about that one, there were approximate recharges of 3,400 per year in each of the 3 years on the council's invoice to Future Places. So that schedule does not tally with what the council thinks it was providing. But you'll see from the differences at the bottom line, the difference is only 250 quid difference, bottom right hand corner, overall. So this is just their P&L note. It's not what actually happened in their P&L account. So
Thank you. Are you able to confirm the position with regards to the facilities management recharges? So is it true that they didn't pay any rent for the first 2 years and then suddenly it jumps in 2023 to like over 42,000 but then Thank you.
Sorry, thank you. The facilities management heading again is a slight red herring in my view. The recharge was for staff from the facilities management function. So it was not a facilities management recharge in the sense of property. And in terms of, just for the avoidance of doubt, to clarify your earlier comment, the Future Places occupied 2 council premises. We can get to that when we get to it, which is in 5.5, I think. But they occupied the Poole Civic Centre Annex for a few months, and then they occupied this campus for a few months. And I use the word a few months, so we're talking probably 9 months in total. And the council did not charge Future Places in my research and my findings for those 9 months worth of occupancy in council buildings, which it should have done statutorily.
Because did that create then a bit of an unfair advantage in some respect? And we're looking at this from a commercial perspective.
I think the government statutory guidance is exactly for that purpose, but Future Places was not in competition with anybody because the council was the only customer of Future Places, so therefore it wasn't providing an unfair competition to anybody other than the council. So that competition element is a slight red herring. But in principle, exactly right, because the council provide everything for free, and the company was competing in a sector where it would obviously be able to offer its services cheaper.
Yeah, so I think all of these kind of build this picture of quite high expenses or expenditure to facilitate what we got for it, and I think that's a essential part of this. Right, moving on to what did BCP get for that money? So for 4.7 million that BCP paid to Future Places. So we're looking at 4.1.15. This is drill down J. Future Places sales to BCP. So this is actual outputs from Future Places that BCP decided to buy from them at 4.7 million. So we've got mostly outline business cases. Now, I think this is another, this is obviously a key part of it. So can I confirm my understanding, Mr. Stannard? At the decision to close Future Places, subject matter experts looked at the work done by Future Places, and this is in this Appendix B chart here, and came up with a value as to how much they thought the work was worth. And then there was a multiplier applied, and that is what BCP paid to Future Places, and then everything that they didn't pay for, that was written off as part of the loan write-off. Is that correct?
Very close to being correct. The value of the work was provided by Future Places, and that's the first column in Appendix B on page 87. So that value of the work was not the council determining the value of the work. All the council's subject matter experts did was to say that work's useful, that work isn't useful, and therefore the value of the useful work was paid for, and the value of the unuseful work was written off.
Thank you, that's helpful. So, I mean, for me, when it comes down to this question of what did we get for the money, the best value question, I would think it might be useful to get a view from the subject matter experts, if any of them are around, or from some examples, to just comment a little bit on why they settled on the amount they did. So, for example, looking at Boscombe, where my ward is, Future Places believed the work they had done was valued at 420,000. Subject matter experts decided that they only really thought 314 of that was useful. It might be helpful to explore a little bit what the thinking was there. How did they decide what wasn't? What kind of work did they decide wasn't? That's something we could think about looking. Maybe ask if there are any subject matter experts to give an example of their thinking there. Is that something that might be possible?
Yes, it is possible, but could I just... This is discussed more in section 7, but in the cold light of day, the council paid for all £7.2 million worth of expenditure, and there is a strong argument we were paying for what we thought was useful, but we were also paying for what wasn't useful because we wrote it off. So in the cold light of day, all we were doing at that closed down process was a categorization difference between useful and not useful, and we paid for it all.
Councillor Slade, I think you had your hand first.
Yeah, just to say, obviously, I was involved at that point when we were facing this situation of looking to close down the organisation, and there was a view from some of us, and Councillor Cox was there as well, that actually some of us didn't feel there was any value in any of this stuff. It was completely pointless, and it had achieved diddly squat. But it was absolutely a case of putting money in two piles so that they come out of two different pots because we were paying for it anyway. I'm not sure where there would be any value in any of our officers or anyone else independent spending any more time trying to work out whether those numbers were right, because the money is gone. The money was funded by BCP regardless. And I think that, there are so many exciting projects going on in Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole right now that, any more time wasted on this is just ridiculous. This exercise is great, but I really don't see that there would be any value in trying to assess this value any further at this point. That's just my view.
Thank you. To be clear, I think it's really important to note that BCP and the taxpayer were no worse off either way. as a result of this. I think that's an important. There's no impact on the taxpayer how this was categorised. It would be more to inform, to give us more of an idea of the kind of work they were doing. That might help bring that out. But not something I'm proposing. Councillor
Can I
Slade.
just add one other thing that there was at the time, those that were involved with Future Places were were trying very hard to demonstrate what a jolly good job they'd done, and therefore there was a sense that, you know, some of these figures where there is a value was almost a negotiation to sort of go, okay, look, you did achieve something, but it was very much a group of people trying to say, look at all these amazing OBCs we've done, right? Which frankly were no different to the full business case. They were just nothing. That they needed to have that, and actually we were very keen. We wanted to get this moved on, so there was really no point in fighting over which pile the money was going to go in, as it was all coming from the same overall figure.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you.
Why did you want to come back on that same point, or is this Councillor Armstrong?
It's within this same point on Appendix B. So there's a number of columns where it's got zeros in, where things like you've got Carter's Quay was given a value of like nearly 12,000, but then there are all the zeros after that. The Lansdowne Design Code and Master Plan, 198,000. Pool Marina, 220,000. So what I hear is that they were given values, but they weren't necessarily that value. But then if the council didn't buy those pieces of work back, what happened to them and who owns them? Where are they? And is there anything in any of those pieces of work that might be of benefit to any projects going forward?
So I think that's part of my thinking, is it might be just of interest rather than of consequence to the taxpayer to understand the kind of work that was considered not valuable, to give us a flavour of what they were doing with that in mind. But perhaps, Mr. Sannard, you might clarify a little bit there.
Yeah, all of the work is available, to the council. The purchased work and the non-purchased, it's there. But in just addressing Councillor Slade's commentary, the prime reason for the categorisation to get it right is for the presentation in the company's P&L account, because obviously we've got a statutory responsibility to ensure the accounts of the company are correct, and we couldn't just say let's not bother with any calculation at the end of there's a what work is useful work and that formed the overall position of the company, which showed ultimately a £2.4 million loss.
Thank you, Councillor Slade.
Yeah, I just think for completeness, the other thing that was factored in was projects that the council were not likely to take forward at any point in time. There may have been a piece of work that might have been useful should a project, like, for example, the super toilets, right, which was the most ridiculous of all the projects. I don't think they actually did a lot of work on it, but given that there was no plan to go forward with any of that work, anything that would have been done would have been deemed as not useful. But actually winter gardens or projects that are in the council's plan to go forward, even data is really useful. I was not a fan of the charrettes, which I'm sure are covered later on. But some of the information that was gathered through those charrettes would have a value because data is money, isn't it? So I think there is that level of, some projects weren't deemed valuable because we were going in a very different direction.
I think that's helpful context to understand exactly why it was done, the process followed, what the considerations were, and ultimately it made no difference to the taxpayer one way or the other because they paid for both. Mrs. Sannard.
And just so if anybody's wondering why Superloos aren't on that list, they're in the category thematic at the bottom. So that covered several of the strands.
Should we look at section 4.2? The commissioning, procurement and contract management processes for any outsourced work. Now, we talked about this a little bit already. This is the outsourced cost of sales, 3.146 million. They use the Bloom framework, which BCP does as well, which just kind of expedites it. They had preferred suppliers. Again, we're not considering that to be abnormal. And it does seem as though it went through scrutiny at the Future Places Board. You can see from 4.2.8 that they were quite clear at board level what they were procuring. So I think this is when the independent members' point earlier on about it being quite broad is really relevant. You know, maybe the size of maybe the level of procuring contracts was not that abnormal, but the sheer breadth of it was. But it does seem as though it went through appropriate governance at the Future Places Board. What do others think on that? Councillor Armstrong.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to refer to the little snip that Nigel's put in titled procurement. That's got the orange grid. It's just above 4.2.9. I'm just noticing in terms of value, there's just lots of to be confirmed on each of the lines, which just concerned me that that wasn't known. Is this like the example that you've included? Is that a typical kind of example?
It's literally a snip from one board meeting. Now, where the TBCs were in place, the next board meeting generally had the update or whatever next. When the figure became known, it was reported to the board.
Thank you, Chair. Because what this kind of, I think it was quite a good introduction into the next point, which starts to touch on the relationships between the two commissioning procurement teams, like within Future Places, but also within the council, and the impact of the fact that there wasn't a resource agreement in place. So I think I'd like a bit more teased out actually about that. Thanks.
Susanna, that comment on the absence of the intended resource agreement and how that created that tension, is that something you would feel able to expand on a little bit? Feel free to say no, happy to leave it at that. It seems as though it's an obvious inference that the lack of an agreed, confirmed, signed off document would make problems at a working level.
You don't have any clear boundaries, roles, responsibilities, who does what, you're inevitably going to argue on, well, you should be doing that and you should be doing that.
Councillor Phipps.
Just a quick question on that table at the bottom. It's got the annual report 2023, undertaking party, Future Places Studio. Can you just confirm what they are?
Councillor Andrews touched on that earlier. So Future Places Studio is a totally unrelated company to Future Places. It just happens to have the same trading, well, Future Places Studio name, totally coincidental. I spotted that myself and I thought, oh, I'll have a quick poke around on that, but yeah, no link to Future Places.
Should we move on to the so this is section 4.3, detail where possible the projects this expenditure was spent supporting. So this is something that I think, if we were imagining what we would do if we were going on and on into more and more detail on this, I think it would be interesting to see an example of the project, what was done by Future Places staff, what was done by the let's see which of the costs outsourced fed into it, and you can do like a map of how that process worked. But I do recognise that would be time consuming and costly to do, but that is something we could think about maybe doing in a selective way. The tiling.
Yeah, it's good we're scrutinising this and going into and picking out some points that really do irk, but nothing that's coming out in this report is a surprise based on our previous knowledge. You know, it's like, oh, isn't this expensive? Aren't the salaries too much? Aren't the bonuses so much? And obviously we had a best value notice which said that the governance was amiss. I'll go back to what Councillor Slade was just saying, you know, about how much do we want to drill down. We're just going to find more of the same. And, you know, you look at some of the relationships as well in between some of the companies and some of the invoicing, and it wouldn't pass, somebody used the word sniff test, for open procurement. Some of them may be valid commercially decided upon things, and yes, they are expensive, but you've employed some very top people. I don't think there's a lot of advantage in going into drilling down any further, because we're going to take more time from Mr. Stannard and his team to do this work, and just ask the question: to what end? To what end are we doing this?
Let me stop you there, though. For this meeting, I think we're just raising areas where we could look further. Next meeting, we can discuss whether or not we think that any of them are goer. But yeah, I wasn't making a proposition that we did that. It was a flagging as a potential area for further work. Councillor Darling.
Thank you. Just to continue, yeah, it is to what end, and I do understand that, and every member of this committee has absolutely the right to pick out and say, I don't like this. This looks wrong, and 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, we're probably right. It is right. You're making a very valid point, but I just go back to what end are we going to get by drilling down and finding it? We're looking for a smoking gun. Are we looking to name and shame previous directors, previous officers of the council, previous councillors? It was one of the tenets, I think, when I was campaigning on the doorsteps prior to being elected, was, you know, the whole public saw it as being just not good value for money, and everything we've looked at has said that, and I feel validated that we were doing the right thing to shut down Future Places. Going in further and further and further is going to, I just take more officer time, more time of this committee when we could be looking at other stuff. Could I just say, we have recommendations on section C, which is 162, which I think is the core tenet here. What we should end up at is reviewing the recommendations which Mr. Stannard had made on page 162 in the pack, 140 in the report, and I think that's really where we, if everybody is finished picking bits and saying that's not right, I think we really need to focus on that, the recommendations.
I take that point, but again, we'll park that discussion. We all have strong views on what needs further looking at and what doesn't, and how to go about that. I think let's park that for next meeting, but I do take on board, we do need to, when we have that discussion, be very alive to what we want to get out of it. At the moment, though, I'm just going through this with a what might we want to know, what could we explore further. I'm leaving it open to the discussion as to whether we decide that's a good approach or not. Councillor Phipps.
Just a quick comment back on that. I see where you're coming from, but at the end of the day, the whole point is to discuss this and it to be open and transparent for the public. We are discussing this in public, and bring up points and raise points that we think we ought to be raising, and not just say, well, it's all right. Well, we've done all this before. We've read it now, and that's it. That's the way it seemed to be coming across here, and I don't agree with that. I think we're doing the right thing here.
We're going to discuss once we've got in front of us an action plan which we'll put together ahead of the next meeting, and then we'll have that discussion. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. I'd have to really disagree with you, Councillor Tarling, because personally, I can't sit here and be part of this committee and be required to provide assurance to the public if I haven't had the chance to go through everything. And I don't want to be complicit in any kind of cover up, intentional or not. So I think that we do need to have this out, and it does need to be aired in front of the public.
Yeah, I do want to wrap this up. I specifically wanted to avoid getting into a question of deciding next steps and the appropriate, because we could keep going indefinitely. We're going to have to come to a judgment as a committee where is an appropriate point to but I'm definitely going to let you come back to that. So I just want to, you can come back to that, because I know you weren't saying a whitewash and closing things down. And I know you're not advocating for keeping going indefinitely and digging and digging and digging too far. So I don't think you're miles away from each other. I don't want us to get into a situation where we're miles apart, when actually we all agree that there's an appropriate line to draw as to when we've done some digging, enough, an appropriate amount, and we just need to come to a decision between us on where that line is. Councillor Tarling, do feel free to come back.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Collins. You said exactly what I was about to say. By no means am I saying your points aren't valid, and I know you instigated or were key in bringing this to the committee, but we're not finding anything that we're not expecting to find, and we can keep picking at the scab, and it's not going to solve anything. I completely respect. We'll sit here, and I'll sit here at every meeting if you have questions that we need to go into, but we are literally picking out bits and saying, I don't like this, I don't like that, and none of us like it. But just bring it back to what end, and by no means, I don't think there is a cover up. We were uncovering it here. That's
So
what
section 4.3, my comment was, we could do a piece of work where we look at, for each outline business case, we could look into, break that down, what work went into it, what commissioned contract went into it, and then we could see like a diagram of all the work that went into that output. And on the basis of that, we could make an assessment as to whether or not that was good value for money. Now, we might decide that that is a useful task. We might decide that that is a level of detail that's not helpful. So it's just one to think about, and then we can come back to that. So on that point, let's look at section 4.4, detail which projects produced initial and full business cases. So we've got 5 outline business cases produced: Constitution Hill, Beach Road Car Park, Chapel Inn Car Park, Christchurch Civic Centre, Poole Civic Centre. And these are pieces of work that BCP paid Future Places for their work. Now, I had a look at the Poole Civic Centre outline business case. Can I just check? So I'm not from Poole, and I haven't been close to some of these. Was it the case that the proposal for the Poole Civic Centre was for BCP to borrow over 50 million to convert it into a boutique hotel? That was the plan, and the basis. And I read the outline business case, and the proposal was based on the fact that there were corridors in the building, and corridors lend themselves to hotels. That was and then there was a whole corollary of, well, then there'd be, you could sell the nearby houses for more because it's near a nice hotel and because of the location, the benefit there. But that was it, and that BCP's paid 156,000 just for that idea. I just want to check and then looking at this, if that were to actually happen, it would cost 52 million. And I just want to check, because I couldn't quite believe this when I was reading it, because I'm not close to this. But the thing that stood out for me was looking at the outline business case. It said, the downside of the strategy is that significant capital funding is needed in one option up to 120 million. While this money can easily be raised, it has implication for the council's revenue account. I can't work out in what kind of, it didn't even fit with the big plan, right? That which allocated 2 million for regeneration. So this is kind of my coming to this fresh. Was this actually the plan, or was there more to it that I'm missing? Sorry, who put their hand up first? I didn't see him.
Well,
Councillor Slade, did you want to give it?
Yeah, just to say, the simple answer to that is yes, and that's one of the reasons why I think there was a lot of concern, because the suggestion that the council would take all of the risk in investing a huge amount of money and then having a hotel in the middle of a roundabout. And the suggestion was that it was an uber desirable location because it overlooked the park, but it also like backs onto the law courts and, you know, lower cost housing. So it, as soon as it became obvious to those of us that were not directly involved with Future Place that this was the idea, there was a lot of outrage. And it was never something that was suggested. I don't think anyone ever said it wasn't possible that it might not make a good hotel, but there was a suggestion at one point that in order for that to be viable, rooms would have to be sold at £600 a night, and there was suggestions of rooftop swimming pools and all sorts. It was utter madness, and I think for some of us on the council at the time was sort of what made us realise that why Future Places was really going in the wrong direction, because this wasn't what Paul needed in the opinion of a lot of people. But yes, you have read that right.
That's helpful, and I don't want to sound like I'm being very negative towards the idea, but my concern is that 52 million just for the cost of converting it into a hotel, and it would be easy for BCP to borrow that. My concern is that somebody in-house. Well, this comes back to the fundamental question for me about the model. If this was all just done in-house, if if all of the contracts out and the outsourcing was just done in-house, maybe there would have been a bit more understanding of the political likelihood of the 118 million being spent. I kind of wonder if this is this a casualty of the fact that there were the people who understood council finances in BCP and the state of local government funding, and they were in BCP, and then there were people in regeneration thinking of what would be a good idea over here. And maybe if they were in-house, there would have been some discussion around when is BCP going to borrow 52 million to own a boutique hotel. So okay, that's helpful. From my understanding, I was surprised at that, and I thought that might be more to it. But my concern is that is an example of when there isn't perhaps an understanding of the realities of what is likely and achievable in the local government context. So, Councillor Andrews, did you have your hand up before? I don't want to skip people.
Yeah, Christchurch Civic Centre had a similar sum of money spent on a similar investigation. The idea on Christchurch Civic Centre wasn't a boutique hotel. It was to actually convert the property into flats. The report was very detailed, comprehensive. It omitted any mention about a flood risk assessment. Christchurch Civic Centre is in a flood zone. Councillor now Ricketts did mention to me that when she used to work for Christchurch Borough Council, she does remember one instance of dealing with floodwater up to her chest outside the Civic Centre. It failed at the first hurdle, that scheme, but nevertheless, Future Places spent a similar sum of money on a scheme which shouldn't have left the starting gate. It's crazy money that they spent, but they had it in their piggy bank and they spent it and spent it and spent it.
Councillor Tarling.
I made mention of what design fees cost as a percentage, and I think if you were going to put in a design fee or fees for business cases and so, you better need a very big number at the end to make it validate the fees you're charging. And I think that's what it is. If you work the other way back and think, how much could I get for a decent hotel and pool, or obviously twice as much as a decent hotel in Christchurch, and then work back from that, you'd probably have a better figure of what you should be spending on the business cases and the development of the scheme to the point where it's commercially viable. Not work it the other way around. Go, oh well, we're going to have a £52 million hotel in Poole. Well, to be honest, there's lots of locations in Poole where you can buy a piece of land and spend a lot less and get a fairly decent hotel. And boutique hotel is not 52 million. 5 million is a boutique hotel.
So I think what stood out for me was that the big plan, which Future Places was supposed to be to implement, set out I think, 2 million for regeneration. And I think there must have been some sort of communication that there was a greater budget available than I think we would see now in the cold light of day. And I found the minutes of the council meeting in November 2021, where it says the then leader, reported that the council had significant funds and resources at its disposal, and that regeneration was exactly what was envisaged in respect to the big plan. And I do wonder if what we're seeing here is a change in the kind of culture towards the finances, and what was achievable. So for some reason, Future Places had an idea that BCP borrowing 52 million to build a hotel was an option, was a goer. And for us now, with seeing the finances and the state of finances now, that seems hard to imagine. But maybe there was just that very different culture about the finances that were available and what was communicated to Future Places about that. Because it strikes me as you're giving the impression of having almost a blank check for come up with brilliant ideas. We're all it's readily available, I think it said. Mr. Sennard.
I think if Adam Richins was here today, he would remind you that the cost of borrowing at that point was low. The administration at the time took a more risk approach. You remember they increased the debt ceiling. This administration reduced that debt ceiling, and they've brought in controls that audit and governance agree when new borrowing is taken out. So you're right to raise everything we've said, but the era and the borrowing threshold was a policy of that administration.
I think that's a useful point. So I think it's just we have to recognise that there's a very different culture towards what is an appropriate level of borrowing for regeneration, and I think that has just very much changed between administrations between 2021 and 2025. And I think that's useful to bear in mind when we look at this, because we might sort of say like that's never going to happen, but maybe then at the time that was on the table for that administration. So,
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for saying that, Mr. Sannard. I was just about to say that we need to be dealing with this in context and be objective. We're getting away from the objectivity, the job that we're all here to do, and that's asking questions of understanding on behalf of the public. The talking about what was good then and what's not good now is not a good use of our time, and is not helping us to get through and achieve what we need to achieve here. So good questions of understanding rather than debating whether something was a good idea or not is really, really key right now.
yes, I mean I think it's a fair point that we are looking at this now, and with the hindsight, I think that 52 million to convert the civic centre, I can't see that being likely even then, to be honest. I can't see that being something that would be advisable even back then at low interest rates, simply because of the direction of public finances at that time. And I think having seen what has happened to local government finances over the last 15 years, I think that there would be real questions about whether or not building hotels was the sort of thing that would have been advisable then. But I think it's important to, that's my view, but I think it's important to note that there was a different administration. They had a different set of vision and what they wanted to achieve, and I think we need to recognize that. The reason I do bring it up though was because the big plan, which Future Places was supposed to reflect, said 2 million for regeneration. And that is the bit that I'm struggling to reconcile, is how they thought that 52 million was readily available when the big plan only committed 2 million. So this is my question. It's not because I'm saying, oh, it would never happen now. It's saying even then I'm struggling to understand why they had the idea that that sort of scale was a goer back then. So I think yeah, you know where I'm coming from with that. Councillor Slater.
I wonder whether Mr. Stannard can confirm, at the time this was going on, and Councillor Beasley will probably recall this, that administration created something called the Futures Fund, which was 50 odd million pounds, which didn't exist, but it was a sort of, I describe it as a credit card limit somewhere over here for stuff that wouldn't require. The whole point of a Futures Fund being created, as I understand it, was that it didn't require what's the word? It didn't require it to be no, not scrutinised. It didn't require it to have a proper business plan. It was a sort of over here as like a bit of a high risk idea. And that was called the Futures Fund. And so it may be that £2 million of actual council money, but actually the future development. I don't know whether this was linked across to the Futures Fund, which was nothing to do with future places. It was a separate sort of money stream, from as I remember it correctly.
So from my perspective, I would find it useful to get a better understanding of what had given reason to believe that projects of that scale were worth pursuing as far as they did. They went as far as doing the outline business case. They'd obviously costed the plan to get to a full business case. They must have been under the impression that that was something that was possible, and I think it would be useful why that was the case.
Stress your point about the 2 million. I think we're probably muddling revenue with capital. So the 2 million that was the revenue at the time, revenue funding, and as Councillor Slater said, there's a futures fund, and then obviously borrowing interest payments would come from revenue, but would be relatively small at the then interest rates on a significant amount of borrowing. Because we were at like 0.1, 0.2% interest rates at that time.
Yeah. Armstrong.
Thank you. I think it's really useful actually to be having this conversation, because it really sets the context for what was going on at the time, because we're not talking about a massive space of time, because by 2023 we were issued with a best value notice. So just like in the months literally leading up to that, the council's looking at borrowing 50 million for a hotel. It doesn't really make any sense to me. I think also to point out, when you look at that was an externally assured piece of work by Leslie Seary, that it's quite interesting to get her points in terms of the culture of the organisation at that time, the relationships between councillors, the relationships between officers and councillors, and the relationship between Future Places and the council. So I think those factors can't be ignored.
And I think for me, it kind of this point about whilst money can easily be raised, basically by borrowing from PWL, I kind of think it's quite integral to understanding why Future Places thought so little of the process that would be needed. You know, the risk being undertaken to the council. That doesn't. It's the two-stage thing. It's the kind of the idea, and then there's the separate considering the risk, the financial risks around it by the council, and you know there was going to be that tension there, and maybe that tension wouldn't have happened if it was in-house. That's something that I'm toying with there. Councillor Beasley.
Thank you, Chair. Well, could I start by thanking Mr. Stannard for the depth and breadth of his report, because there's clearly been a huge amount of of work in collating this, and I can only imagine how difficult some of that has been. And I congratulate him where he hasn't been able to do that for admitting that that is the case. And clearly, we're not ever going to get to a position where we know everything, because I think that would be an impossible task for anybody. We seem to have spent quite a bit of time on this particular issue, but could I just go back a little bit in terms of a number of issues have been raised quite legitimately, and quite often there have been instances where we've got missing parts of the jigsaw. And I think we've discussed at previous meetings the necessity almost of going back to the people who might have the knowledge. Now, that's obviously going to be in large measure the former managing director and chief operating officer of Future Places, but it will probably be for other people also. And I think you were intending to compile a list of questions for various people, and a number of those probably will arise out of this evening's discussion, because I think it's important that we get really to the heart of some of those issues, and it is a balanced outcome that we can all understand. We may not accept what we're told, or on the other hand, it may help to illustrate why we were worried or concerned about particular issues. In terms of the item we've been spending quite a bit of time on, I won't deal in depth with that. Hotel development is what I do as a day job, and so I would want to know a huge number of other pieces of material information before I could come to any kind of conclusion. But intrinsic in that is finding out if this issue is one that concerns us, finding out from the former officers in particular of the company what was proposed in terms of the funding in particular, what was proposed in terms of offloading that funding, sharing the risk, etc. And I simply don't know. It's a big number, and I'm not going to speculate about that number, much as I'm tempted to do, because from a professional point of view, I really shouldn't do that at this meeting. But I do think we need far more information back before we can make an informed judgment, if that's what we want to do. But I do also bear in mind that there is danger in going back to the circumstances that existed in the financial climate then as compared to now, both for the council and indeed in terms of borrowing costs. So if you're prepared to be doing that, Chair, maybe this is one of the items that could be added to that list, but it'll need to have a lot of sort of sub-questions to it for it to be meaningful and worthwhile for us to look at in the future. And I think Mr. Stannard has flagged up throughout the report a number of areas where further information is required from those same people. They may be officers of the council, they may be former officers of the council, but they for certain will be former officers of the company at various different levels, I suspect. And so if we could do that, I hope that will inform us much better than speculating about what we have in front of us in certain parts of the report this evening. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. That was helpful. Just for your awareness, I am taking everything from the outline business case for Poole Civic Centre. There's a section on funding options where it sets out the proposal would be hotel development through prudential borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board. So I'm not sort of speculating anyone, I'm just taking it from that. But I completely agree. I would like to ask to understand a little bit better from those involved, the relevant stakeholders, what made them, phrase it better obviously, but why were they of the opinion that that was a realistic proposal to be pursuing to full business case? Because they must have been given some indication from council, from the politicians, that there was an appetite for that. And I think that's a useful thing to understand, because that, I think this comes back to a really key point, which actually we'll come to next, is in section 4.5, going outside the stated terms of reference. It says FPL was set up to support the aspirations set out in the council's big plan. and I think this is really critical to understanding this. The whole idea of the future places was tied to the vision of that particular administration. And this concerns me for the setting up of something that presumably is going to last, it's supposed to last for longer than an administration. It's almost asking for trouble when the whole purpose of it is so pegged to a vision of a particular administration. What the plan is and what the process is, and the managing of the fact that that administration is going to change. And the big plan was a time limited vision, and how this entity was supposed to endure when it was tied to one administration's vision. So I think this point about understanding the appetite for borrowing at that scale is tied to that question about how that Future Places was tied to that administration's vision, and I think that's something worth exploring. Councillor Beasley.
Sorry, if I could just add to that, Chair, just for the avoidance of doubt, at no stage have I ever been involved or even been consulted on any aspect of any project to do with Future Places. My only involvement has been through audit and governance, from the days when I was chair of audit and governance and we had some preliminary issues that we wanted to raise and we wanted to understand better, right the way through to today. And I've never got any closer to it than that, because I've always in my mind, as a member of A&G, divorced myself from virtually anything else that was going on, in order that we could be completely focused and objective through the governance process that we are here to maintain. But I just want to make that very clear, so there is no doubt in anybody's mind about it. As I said just now, I've probably got more questions than almost any other member of the committee about this particular project, and I would have quite a lot of challenge in there as well, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, that's noted. So as I said at the beginning, I think we should all feel free to send me your questions and I'll do my best. I want to save Ms Stannard doing any further work on this where avoidable, so my plan is to just pull together the questions that you send to me, and then we'll have that in front of us to facilitate the discussion next meeting. So I suggest we try and finish section 4 and then take a break and go from there. So section 4.5, it was any expenditure activity outside the stated terms of reference. I mean, I think this scope creep thing, I mean, it's judgment, isn't it? What counts as a scope creep? And I think the independent members' point early on about the breadth is maybe not what you would have done if you were a more modest startup. It does seem that there was a huge amount of breadth, but as it says, the big plan, their scope was quite wide. It was about supporting regeneration quite widely, so it was never expected to have a very limited scope. So I suppose you could say the scope creep was somewhat inevitable. Councillor Andrews.
Yeah, we're talking about, I think it's page 93, the large number. I may have mentioned this in a previous bit, but 4.5.3, there's mentioned there that one of the senior officers of Future Places accompanied the leader of the council to a meeting in London with KPMG to discuss the beach huts sale and leaseback thing. You know, obviously that was a day up in London, presumably, or wherever their offices are. But you know, obviously, Future Places were getting drawn into numerous things and not concentrating on what they should have been doing is 2 or 3 particular projects and actually getting something over the line. But you know, as we're told by the relevant minister at the time, that idea of a sale and leaseback was a dodgy deal, as he said to the Daily Telegraph.
Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Actually, that does link with something that comes a bit more into section 5 about the involvement of councillors in the day-to-day operations of Future Places, and that it was just deemed to be a bit too much. I think it was 5.3.4 where it talks about that, which has me wonder. I mean, just looking at this again, the beach hut sale, and whether that was part of Future Places business or not. Are there any other examples of where Future Places got pulled into doing other pieces of work or into other activities that was driven by councillors as opposed to the business cases.
Sandra, did you want to comment on whether now is the best place to talk about that? Because I recall there's another discussion of that.
Right, there is a section in the report which I might try and find in the break that refers to that issue, but I can't immediately remember the number.
I think you're quite right to raise that. You know, as I might say, it's inevitable, but surely it has to be managed, and there are reasons for it. And if I think understanding where those steers came from is really important. So my question is whether or not, if there's a section on that later, as I think there is, we'll discuss it there. But if not, we'll circle back to it. I think we can kind of just note this section for now and come back to that point. Oh, sorry, Ms. Acton.
Question of understanding, please, on 4.5.3. The COO was involved with the leader and the council officers in at least one meeting with KPMG in London. Is it possible, Mr. Stannard, to ask KPMG to release the minutes of this meeting so we can clarify why the chief operating officer was in attendance?
Whether KPMG kept minutes or not, I don't know, but I think we would be better off asking the chief operating officer, and I think he's already given an opinion to Councillor Connolly on why he was at the meeting, and it was broadly because of his past experience in financial banking.
So I was actually just asking the monitoring officer. The chief operating officer emailed a committee member who then forwarded it to all members, and we haven't confirmed. I'm not sure at this stage if now is the right time to say what individuals have said to us, but I think my judgment is that the whole point was that this person wanted to make sure that their perspective was included more. So their view is that their role at that meeting was not related to future places. But I think that's again, perhaps a line of questions which we could ask directly of the individual, and we could consider asking others as well. So we'll come back to that next week as a possible thing to inquire. Oh, please, Monitoring Officer.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's important for the public to have any access to those documents or that correspondence. I think referring to it generally is probably acceptable, and it may well be something you definitively want the committee to agree. They will ask the individual about, so that representation can be made in public proceedings and make sure that the public have access to it if that's being relied upon. But I think what you're saying is you're making reference to a correspondence which seems to be remains private at the moment, but of course under the public access rules, the public may be entitled to see it if it's being relied upon. So I hope that's clear.
Thank you. So should we look at 4.6 and then take a comfort break? Was there a deliverable plan for Future Places Limited to pay the working capital loan? This is, I suppose, it's a difficult scope item for you, Mr. Stannard, to say whether there was a deliverable plan, because I suppose there's an element of judgment in that. But it does look clear as though that there was consideration of the likelihood of it being able to be paid back. As long as 2/3 of the projects are approved by the council, they would secure enough funding to pay for any remaining projects. So the idea is that the loan would be repayable as long as 2/3 of the projects they did were bought by the council. Which was that? How does that correspond with the amount bought by BCP?
Not necessarily sure I can answer the question directly, but the fact that it was the council's commissioning plan, which BCP Future Places then responded to through their business plan, there is an argument to say, well, why wouldn't 2/3 be because they were what the council asked for? And then we're into the quality debate that Councillor Tarling talked about earlier, and affordability, etc. So, but we're talking about the outline business case stage here. So, the rationale was sound in principle.
Did any committee members have any questions on this section? So just to check my understanding for the benefit of the public, there was a working capital loan of 400 was agreed at the beginning to get them going. And that was,
That was basically a precedent from all the other companies that BCP Council or predecessor councils had in place beforehand. So it's basically a facility that all council companies had at the time, and it was just giving that initial working capital loan leeway should it be needed. And obviously Future Places, with the intention in the first year, was for it to be funded entirely from revenue. So there wasn't an obvious reason in the first year why that working capital loan would be required.
so that first year was the 5,000.
The 5,000, I believe, was a pragmatic trial transaction to make sure that the bank account facilities were all working and the direct debit facilities were there, ready for the point that they would be needed.
And then in the second year, 385 and the 10 were drawn down. Of the first 400. And then it was approved that there would be a further 8 million, well, up to 8 million was agreed. So after that, they drew down 800, then 850, then 1450. And then 500, and then 750. And then the rest of that is then payment back from Future Places to BCP as the repayment and the loan write-off. So does anybody have any questions on kind of where the loan went? How much was, where the money went? Back to the point at the beginning, this kind of question of what happened to the money, where did the money go? Does anybody have any kind of questions or lack of clarity over this this aspect of it? Again, from my perspective, I think it's there, it's clear, it's accounted for. What we got for it is another matter. But does anybody else disagree with that? So that they drew down 4.7 million.
That was the peak of the loan.
And then they repaid 2.3,
leaving 2.4 outstanding.
And they repaid the 2.3 with the receipt of what BCP paid them for the work done.
Right.
They used that to pay back 2.35, and then the rest of it was written off. So I think this is helpful in being clear in exactly how much was lent, how much was paid back, how much was written off. It's good to have this that clarity. Councillor Armstrong.
Yeah, I agree. Can you say, Nigel, and apologies if I've missed this, when or what sort of date was the loan agreement signed off, and was all of that put in place?
Yes, they are all, where are they? They should be in this section, or are they? Yeah, so the first loan agreement was Sorry, the second loan agreement, the 8 million loan agreement was signed on the 9th of the, I physically got the loan agreement on one of my files here if you want to have a look at in the break. So it's, you know, physically signed, sealed. So 9th of the 8th, 2022 was the 8 million, and then the 400,000, I think, was earlier in that financial year. The exact date is somewhere in the report, but I can't immediately lay my hands on it. It's probably in the table at the front of the report.
That went to Cabinet and full council, that 8 million. I think it says paragraph 48 in report to council 12 and 4.6.2.
So I found the date. So the first agreement, the 400,000, was signed on the 25th of January 2022.
And they didn't actually lend 8 million.
Never lent 8 million.
They agreed the capacity to borrow up to 8 million.
Correct.
The peak of the loan was 4.75.
Correct.
But they could have loaned, they could have been more. Okay. Shall we pause there for a comfort break? And what do others think? I think we should try and press on for some more of section 5, but maybe try to aim not past 9. Something, would that suit others? See if we can get through as much of 5 as we can. Would that suit others? Thank you, everyone who stayed watching and for being with us. We are going to aim, I think, to try to get through as much of section 5 as we can, while hoping to finish at a sensible time. So, item 5.1. Section 5 is items requiring specific assurance. These are particular themes or areas of focus that were identified when we agreed the scope, and we'll work through them one by one. So the first one is staff bonuses. The justification for payment, who approved the payment, was this in line with the shareholder agreement? So I think useful to draw out this snip from the cabinet paper, which made it clear that the attraction was, the purpose was to compete for talent with private sector developers, and attract staff who may not otherwise consider working with or for the public sector. So the compensation packages and benefits more closely aligned to private sector offerings, which would include a discretionary bonus scheme, private health insurance, travel allowance, training. And then there's this question of reserved matters. And reserved matters are to be approved by the council. The question is, what is meant by council? And I think you've drawn that out in here, and interested on committee members' views. I think obviously we all agree that some reserved matters should go to full council. Some reserved matters should clearly not go to full council. What are our thoughts on that judgment in the case where it's not specified? Any Councillor Tarling?
I think you're right. I can't think of anything more to say. It's the brief that would have been given by the council at the time in its establishment and its governance rules. Again, back to governance, and it was sufficient scrutiny, be it cabinet or full council, made, and that matter of referral. It seems to be that other places in the report where that hasn't happened, you know, where even by its own rules of governance, you know, there seems to be occasions, for example, on the bonuses where there's reference to, you know, the COO will refer to the council, and there's sort of no evidence that's actually happened. I don't know how many instances of that there are, but that is in essence where there was a failing of communication between certainly the full council and the board of FPL.
Thank you. Ms. Stannard.
And I know we'll come on to recommendations in due time, but I've made a key recommendation. I think that any future shareholder agreements need to have clearer wording, and probably makes sense to have categorizations, because I perceive that some things, as Councillor Tarling has said, probably do warrant full council approval and some things don't. And the full shareholder agreement is shown in one of the appendices. I think it's 6 point something at the back end of the report. And there's 42 reserved matters, and you wouldn't expect council to consider every one of those, even though admittedly a lot of them are rare events, but you wouldn't necessarily see some of those matters being a council matter. I mean by that, full council.
Councillor Phipps.
Yeah, I hear what's being said. It's all very vague, and therefore, at the end of the day, I presume we haven't got much of a leg to stand on to say, you know, that it wasn't right that they shouldn't be paid. However, in principle, and on the face of it, it's pretty crazy, really. I don't know what they achieved to actually get any bonuses. It seemed to have been done on an overall sort of basis, and even someone who'd been there, for instance, for 2 months gets 2 months of the percentage of their salary. It's all pretty disastrous, really. And at the end of the day, where was the governance on all of this? We had a shareholder delegate who was our CE at the time, I believe, and you know, obviously no comment made on it. And at one of the meetings, we had others there. We had the chief executive, the director of finance, and the director of law and governance and monitoring officer. All sat there and thought it was fine. So we haven't got a leg to stand on, but I think overall it was very, very wrong what happened. And governance-wise, it was pretty disastrous. There wasn't any because it was so vague.
Yeah, I think that's it. I very much support the recommendation. This is no reason, there's no reason to not be very specific on this when you're doing the shareholder agreement. I suppose one area you could dig into further as to whether, whether outline business cases delivered on time, on or ahead of budget. I don't know if that was the case or not, and that might have fed into that decision. But I suppose the more fundamental question is, the idea is this is a whole separate private company. It's got its own board, its own remuneration committee. I would have thought that they would be responsible for agreeing things like the remuneration and the bonus and everything. So how does that sit with the fact that it's council owned? And again, it comes back to that tension. It's a private company operating like a private company, but as taxpayers, we might expect to have more involvement, and that's why I don't think there should be any lack of clarity there. So one question I had was other council-owned organisations, so things like Bournemouth Development Company. Does full council approve the remuneration for staff there? I don't know anything about it, so it might not be an appropriate comparison. But would the remuneration for staff of other council-owned bodies come to full council? Don't want to put you on the spot there. You might not know that off the top of your head.
You are putting me on the spot a bit, and I don't believe they do go to council.
So that's my understanding as well. Councillor Beasley, your experience, you say they don't. So my feeling is that there's enough. It's not obvious that they have to. So the recommendation is sound, but that's a possible area of inquiry. Is what do we do for other council-owned companies? What's normal for tackle companies for that involvement, and just kind of understand that a bit better. But either way, I think we would all agree with the idea that full council would probably have liked to have been able to take a vote on that. Sorry, did you want to come in on clarification?
Yeah, it probably should be clarified that the other council companies don't have a structure identical to Future Places in the sense of having managing directors and a workforce in the same fashion as Future Places did. So that needs to be taken into account.
Councillor Armstrong.
It's a question for Mr. Stannard with regards to the remuneration committee. Did you find any minutes of any of the discussions, any record keeping? And apologies if I've missed this, but on what basis were people given bonuses, especially if they'd only been in their team for like 2 months? When I look at a performance and the work that we've, the presentations that we've received regarding how staff are performance managed within the council, if someone's been in a team for 2 months, they barely got through their induction, how could they be responsible for hitting a target or, attracting a success fee?
Section 5.18 on page 96, big number, 74 of 190 of my, is the rationale for the bonus payment. And then in terms of the remuneration committee minutes, I have not been able to find any, but that does not necessarily mean they did not exist. That's laid out at 5.112, and there is a snip at the top of page 97 about this. So a terms of reference of the committee existed, yeah. So there's a little bit of relevance there to your question.
And I think they obviously knew that it was important and needed to be done, say above board, but maybe the wrong word, because the board of Future Places decided to delegate it to Lord Kerslake, and it was 8 months delayed because of the waiting for the recruitment of the chair and the non-executive directors. So they obviously were aware that they needed to do it appropriately within Future Places. It's just this, and we know that Lord Kerslake was an experienced director, it comes back to this question about what the council expected and that fundamental tension, acting like a private company on the taxpayer money. So, yeah, I think with hindsight, it would have been good if it came to full council and full council could have had a discussion about bonuses. But if it's not clear in the shareholder agreement, it's not clear. So I support that recommendation, but we could think about some further work on that. That could be something we consider. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. Just to add quick with regards to doing a bit more, considering that as an issue, can we also consider the role of the shareholder representative in that discussion or in that piece of work, how involved they were or not? I think it would be really useful to understand a bit more about the steer that came from them in this as well. Thanks.
Just reading from the report, that the shareholder representative was aware that they decided to delegate the decision to Lord Kerslake. So we know that they were there and present. But it's that kind of question of could they have gone further? This is
The snip on the top of page 97 at 7.7 is a recommendation that Bob Kerslake liaise with Graham Farrant regarding formally communicating the proposal. So I think there was a very clear acceptance that the board representative, i.e. Lord Kerslake, had to agree the proposal with the shareholder representative acting as his default position as representing the council.
Armstrong.
On a separate issue, I just remembered actually what the point I was trying to make earlier with regards to the loan. It's a question for Mr. Stannard about whether bonuses were paid out of that loan, and if they were, was that deemed to be, was that an acceptable use of the loan?
I've just had a look on the loan agreement, and the loan wording says in covering working capital costs. So the bonus payment was part of working capital costs. So yes, is the answer. It was a legitimate cost within the grant. Within the loan.
Sorry, thank you for clarifying. I was just puzzled that if you're borrowing and you're a company and you're technically in debt, how would you be getting in more debt to then pay bonuses to staff? I don't understand.
And I think this is one of those tensions, but it's like the consultancy fees. It's the tension between what's normal in the private sector compared to what BCP staff would be used to. Did you want to add on that?
Well, you're exactly right, and it's it's only another form of remuneration, isn't it? So it's the same as a salary being incurred. So it's the principle of more debt being incurred, as you put it, is the point of a working capital loan, because remember, it's not a loan with the bank. The only entity paying Future Places was the council, and therefore the council pays Future Places for Future Places to then pay us back the loan. So it's a working capital loan, not a loan you'd associate with a bank, because obviously the bank doesn't pay the entity it's to pay.
I mean, I am aware in the private sector that bonus schemes are normal, and the split between salaries and bonuses is kind of, they sort of see them together, and a bonus for a team is normal. Again, is that right with taxpayer money? Yeah, but the council agreed that they had to do this to attract private sector people who would otherwise not work for the council. So I kind of, part of me thinks that this is, again, like we said, this is what comes with the territory of deciding we want a quasi startup that's competing in the private sector. This is what these bonuses are part of that. It was proposed right from the very, very start. We will need a discretionary bonus scheme. private health insurance, travel allowance. That was the vision, so that we would attract, and this is what you get. Yeah. I mean, we could think about doing some more looking into this. We could come back to that next week. Let's keep moving. Happy to move on to 5.2, fees paid to headhunters in appointing executive directors, non-executive directors and staff. Again, I think it's probably worth mentioning that previous councillor Broadhead, when he was here, said that he thought that they did quite a good job of getting good quality non-executive directors, and Lord Kerslake, you don't get them immediately. And I think it is probably worth reflecting that they did clearly go to effort to recruit experienced directors to the board. Yeah. Did anyone have any comments? Councillor Phipps?
No, you haven't said that, but I still was quite incredulous that they thought, as you've mentioned before, they were in debt and all the rest of it and haven't got loads of money, but it's all right, we'll just spiv out £13,000 just to see, to get some directors. Surely this is the sort of thing that they could have advertised themselves. Didn't they do anything much for themselves? There are consultants all over the place, and we'll just employ somebody to do that. I was quite incredulous when I saw it. I thought, okay, it's 13,000. Perhaps in the scheme of things, it's not a lot, but it is, isn't it? When you haven't got any money, and you just you've got loans, and you're supposed to be paying them back by a certain time. That whole thing, it's mad in my view. I actually wrote on my bit of paper, this is bonkers. Okay, thanks.
No, but I think you're right. Again, that, like, I'm sure Councillor Tarling would say that it's quite normal if you need to get a good quality non-executive director, you need to go to the companies that will help you find one and approach them. But they're acting like an established regeneration company, right, that's successful and has made some money. And I suppose maybe that's the tension. We wouldn't think much of it perhaps if it was not in its infancy, and council owned. I didn't have any other comments on that section. Did anybody else? Okay, should we move on to 5.3, declarations of interests made during disclosable pecuniary interests in respect of BCP Future Places Limited. Don't all jump in at once. So we know board governance was an issue, and that was raised in the external assurance review. But some of that came down to the fact that there were councillors on the board. And obviously the view was that was in the interest of getting it going while they found these non-executive directors, and the idea was that Councillor Broadhead and Councillor Mellor and Graham Farrant were board members until they were replaced by the appropriate people. So there were obviously going to be conflicts in that period of time. Do we think that they were managed appropriately? So let's look. It's quite a big section, this, isn't it? We're all looking through it. This is so the DLUC external assurance review. If I'm looking at 5.3.4, the original governance structure did not reflect good practice in terms of governance, and elected members were too involved in the day-to-day operational management of the company and commissioning activity. However, as we know ourselves, the idea was to get it going quickly and then replace them. They didn't intend for that to be the long-term setup, but it did mean there were conflicts in that initial period. Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, I mean, the best value notice says it already. I mean, and it's reflected by the comments from some members at the time, and certainly during the discussion process, and certainly my involvement in OSB at the time. was flagged up even then, that the issue was governance related, and I don't want to go over sort of my personal involvement in the process at the time with OSB, but it's just evident that there was a relationship that wasn't completely transparent, and the interests were, as it says there, conflicts of interests. It wasn't as transparent as it should be for this type of company. For a private company, absolutely fine. It's perfectly acceptable. But you know, we're talking public money, and when you're dealing with public money, governance has to be fairly transparent, and it wasn't, and that's why it was mentioned in the dealer best value notice. Don't, you know, they don't write those things lightly, and it was one of the key tenets.
Mr. Senna.
Just in the spirit of total transparency, you know, Councillor Connolly, you hit the nail on the head in terms of it was only ever meant to be a stopgap to get the company going. Councillor Mellor, Councillor Broadhead were, you know, coming off the board as soon as practicable. And you'll see in the small print in italics below the box at 5.3.3, the Chief Operating Officer and the Managing Director also expressed their concern at the time of, you know, the governance issue associated with having councillors on the board. So I think it was, I suppose what I'm saying is it was wholly agreed all round by everybody that it wasn't ideal, but it was only a stopgap.
Mr. Tarling.
Yeah, I wasn't going to go into this because I went through this in my first OSB where Councillor Broadhead called me out the fact I've been interviewed twice by Future Places. So it's already on record. And there was I have a chain of emails from Councillor Broadhead that says his involvement post his leaving the board, he was still involved in personnel making decisions. And he said in an email to me that was fairly normal practice to do that. Well, in my book, that is not normal practice, and I said I have actually forwarded this to previous monitoring officers at the time. I didn't pursue a complaint against Councillor Broadhead, and he's not here to answer, so it's unfair for me going this further. But there's other stuff here that went on, involvement beyond what was registered at Company's House.
Thank you. I think that's noted. Mr. Beasley.
Chair, it's not for me to say because you're chairing the meeting, but I think we're getting into some fairly uncharted waters here. And it goes back to my previous comments. Admittedly, Councillor Tarling has just said, and he isn't here, so I won't go any further, but it leaves an accusation hanging in the air. I feel distinctly uncomfortable with that because I don't think that's the way that we should be conducting this. We need to be really careful. You know, in correspondence, I have flagged up another instance, whether or not the council is on the wrong end of legal proceedings as a result of that, I've no idea. But I think there's a good chance it may be. And I'm just putting down a marker that we need to be really careful about how we conduct our business here at Audit and Governance, and that we are focused on our remit. And our remit isn't, I don't believe, as wide as some people seem to believe.
Thank you, that's noted. I think that we are, the matter at hand was the conflict of interest kind of inherent in the setup managed appropriately? And I think that we do not know how it was managed in enough detail to make a judgment as a committee, and we're not doing that here, and the report doesn't do that. But I think it is, we can note the experience of individuals that could raise into question that perhaps it was not always managed well. And I think, you know, being really fair, I think it would be difficult to manage it quite well because of that inherent conflict of interest, which the report flags. So, I mean, being more of a risk-averse nature myself, you could say, why on earth did they not set up the company 8 months later, once they'd found the chair and the NEDs, it was that need for pace and that need for getting it going quickly that I think meant that it didn't start off on the footing that they would have wanted it to longer term. So I'm sympathetic to them saying it wasn't the ideal setup, but maybe it didn't have to be sort of started anyway, and then down the line, because those conflicts and that influence was going to be inevitable there. So I think we all know the governance issue there, and that was flagged. I also think it's worth flagging that at the time there were proposals made, if I can recall from minutes, there were proposals made to have cross-party councillors on the board. And that seems to me to be another obvious way in which you could have council involvement without it being directly the leader and deputy leader involved. And that seems to have been voted against. So I do think there was an appetite for taking on a risk around conflicts, which is unavoidable. But we're not taking a view on the individuals. Should we look at this 5.3.7, the chief executive granting a dispensation to the leader? I am prepared to grant a dispensation for this decision to be taken by Councillor Mellor. BCP Future Places is being funded by grant funding, covering costs incurred at this stage, but not contributing to any surpluses in a manner similar to the way that service directorates are funded, and therefore I'm content that the dispensation is appropriate for this decision. Mrs. Sanna, do you think you could explain that a little bit more clearly, what the rationale for that was?
I believe I've circled the word grant funding actually, and I think that would have been better to have said revenue funding, because I don't think Future Places was funded by grant funding. But the principle of the decision is Councillor Mellor at the time was the portfolio holder for finance, and that was the decision maker to approve the budget carry forward that was being recommended. So the chief executive granted the dispensation in line with the constitutional element there that's referred to on page 365 of the Constitution. I don't know if Robin might want to add anything further on that, but I think I've probably said it all. But.
And was it the thinking that effectively there couldn't be a benefit to the council by these decisions because it's not contributing to surpluses, there wouldn't be an incentive to make a decision one way or the other, as would impact BCP? Does that make sense? Was that kind of the argument? Why did it matter that they didn't contribute to any surpluses and they're similar to other service directors? You see what I'm getting at? Just understanding what and maybe we can put a pin in this one and say that one of the things we might like to follow up is to ask those involved how they managed and how they got comfortable with the conflicts of interest and how they managed that. That might be a useful way forward. Councillor Armstrong.
It's just a point of clarification, because I agree that term of the word, that grant funding, is confusing. So was that the public works loan? Was it that funding, or was it some other type of funding?
No, this was very definitely at the end of the first year of Future Places, so the end of the 21-22 financial year, when we're talking about a revenue carry forward of unspent monies that had been set aside for regeneration. So they were transferring revenue budget into the next financial year. So it was revenue budget that had already been approved by council. They were just slipping it from one year to the next because it'd been unspent.
I think this is an important area, and we can think about asking the individuals involved, giving them the opportunity to give their And moving on to 5.3.10, this is the within future places. So this isn't the conflict between councillors and future places directive. This is about other future places. And we talked a little bit before about this overlap with work on the stewardship initiative. And again, I think that might be one to consider asking a little bit more about how that was managed, and the contracts to those also involved in the stewardship initiative. How was that flagged? Then there's this type mark. 1% of household values to go to the stewardship type mark. Oh, sorry. Was any of that audible? Oh, sorry about that. No, on that section, I was just talking through this. We're moving on to within future places. I think it would be useful to explore a little bit more about how business links were managed, because we know that in the business community, it's usual to go out to your contacts, and yeah, how that is managed, it would be a useful thing to understand a bit better. This stewardship kite mark, this does stand out, that this is the 1% of household values to fund to go to the stewardship kite mark, which we understand was a proposal at the time by the stewardship kite mark on the stewardship initiative. That was a proposal that they was exploring at that time. It's no longer a live proposal, and it isn't a registered kite mark, but the thinking was that houses built by future places, if they met the criteria for that kite mark which was being designed, would benefit from that. I just check my understanding is right. Councillor Slade.
Yeah, I just want to get clarity, because when I was reading again the email that we received, there was a suggestion that this kite mark organisation is something for which the previous chief executive is involved with. If that's the case, then she's not, no? Managing director, sorry, chief executive, the managing director. The implication was that this was an organisation that she was sort of she co-founded. Is it, if she co-founded an organisation and there's then a proposal that monies might go to an organisation that's not yet founded, is there clear evidence throughout that her declarations of interest, and that was that to me, there's something not right about that. Yeah. There's something so not right about that. Founds an organisation, makes a suggestion, to even make the suggestion that a percentage of the sale of the properties goes to an organisation that you founded. It's probably the worst stinky thing I've heard so far. But where's the evidence that every time there was a meeting that was?
Let Robin speak.
Sorry, I just can't.
Say something.
Sounds stinky. It may not be.
Again, and taking on board the comments about being careful. We're not judging here, but I think we are saying that we would like more information about this. If you look at the paper that went to council, it was only in the confidential appendix, and I found it on page 333. And I feel that it is probably reasonable in the comments made in the report that may have been better flagged to councillors at various stages. And that might be something we would want to understand a little bit more about, whether it was, why it was not better understood at the time, because the implications of that could have been quite significant. 1% of all homes built. Now, I completely take on board that at the time it was still in design as a scheme. It wasn't finalised. It was a possibility, and there would have been decision points along the way before anything got built, at which that would have then been considered again. So it didn't come close to, an actual council agreement. But I do think that how that was flagged is pertinent. Councillor Tarling.
Can I just say we're making no inference here at all. The fact that the stewardship initiative was founded by the same person, that doesn't mean that there wasn't full transparency and due diligence done on that. And what Councillor Slade has said, yes, one's gut feel is like, well, that's convenient, is by no means us saying that it's anything untoward has happened.
For clarity, I'm asking the question whether there is evidence that appropriate disclosures are evidenced in the documentary meetings at which these were discussed. Because I don't know that, I don't have access to that. That's the question I'm asking, is if that was not disclosed, that in itself feels like it should be questioned.
I think 5.3.11 at the top of page 102 covers that.
So what I would say is that the kite mark, that was spelled out in the business case, which went to council in the confidential appendix, the idea for 1% to go to the stewardship initiative. I've just looked at the outline business case for Poole Civic Centre again. And on the strategic objectives, it repeats the stewardship kite mark and the link to the website. So it was clearly still there as a possibility, but it was not fleshed out what the implications of that would have been. But that's not to say that it wouldn't have been fleshed out at the decision, when it came to the actual decision by council to proceed with the business case. But I think we can agree that there's more we'd like to know about how well that was flagged. Councillor Armstrong.
Thank you. At the time when this person was being appointed, was it known then that they had founded this initiative, and was it intended that, sorry? Right, that's what I'm getting at. I don't know how to say it.
No, I completely. I think to be clear, I think part of her experience was largely part of her experience as founding this up, and the connections and the experience as part of that. So that was clearly articulated, I think, at the time of her appointment. That's the expertise that she brought, and so you would expect with that came the other what do you call it? The associations with the stewardship initiative was understood as coming with her. Did you want to add to that?
No, so that person would be profiting from this 1% of properties. I think what I'm hearing is that we want to understand a bit more. Yeah.
I think we should just rest that we want to find out more about this. I think we're all agreed on that, and we need to know more. Mrs. Anna.
Can I draw attention to 5.316, because it's words on a page. Any words can be put on a page. By the end of the day, it would have been the council's decision to commit 1%, 2%, no percent to the funding of a proposal. That was clearly in our governance gateways. So, whether there would have been a conversation around, well, it says it there, who knows? It's impossible to say.
I think we should move on and flag that as an area to understand better. So, section 5.4, declarations of interest made regarding personal friendships and business associations in recruitment of staff. So, I think we covered the recruitment already in section 3.1. So this was identified as an area of interest, but I think it's already been largely covered by earlier sections. And again, we've flagged that as an area where we might want to ask the individuals concerned. We can always do that. There is a note to say that it was unclear of what do we say here? The information in the report sets out a particular order of recruitment and identification of individuals, and one of the stakeholders involved has indicated that actually there may have been a different order there. So I think we can flag that as something to clarify with those involved. Effectively, who knew who before appointment. I think we can make a note of clarifying that. 5.5, right, rent of offices in Exeter Road. Now this was flagged as an area of particular interest because there was press coverage of this item. And just to check my understanding, what happened was the day after the election, when Drew Mellor ceased to be a councillor, he purchased the licensing company that acted for the premises. Is that correct, Councillor Slade?
Can I just seek some clarity, because it's really important on the timing, and there is a case going through at the moment around this, in which I'm being summoned. My understanding is the election took place on the Thursday. The count for the election didn't take place until the Friday. Therefore, on the Friday, the councillors were still councillors because they had not yet been replaced by new councillors. That is my understanding. It would be really useful if we could get clarity on that, because you've not yet, you have not yet been replaced. Therefore, if that was the case, and the completion of that property, whoever purchased the property through whatever vehicle or company, took place on that Friday, on a technicality, would that person still have been a councillor? What is the law in relation to when you cease being a councillor, because you're still covered by certain things, you've still got your kit and all the rest of it, and obviously that person was not they were not a candidate for that election, so they weren't trying to win at the next election, but they, I believe, were still technically a councillor.
I think that's one for the monitoring officer to perhaps take away, rather than be put on the spot on that. Unless you want to.
Thank you, Chair. I think it could openly say, yes, that's correct, Councillor Slade. I think the difficulty is making sure the context of how we answer that is put in, because there are serious offences that can be committed. And the monitoring officer, had the councillor still been, if you like, in office and active, the monitoring officer has if you like, a different variation of weaponry. It's not an automatic necessarily referral to a prosecution. So it's important to put it in context publicly that yes, you're right, but of course, to jump to the conclusion of what the consequences may be, and I know you weren't doing that, but for any councillor, obviously context is key, and it's probably better we do come back and clarify the law hypothetically, and then committee can make their own judgments from that and apply it to the facts.
The reason I raise it is because the chair said it was the day after, and it actually wasn't. It was the day after the election, but not the day after the new councillors had taken office. It was on the same day.
But I think we need to be clear that it was the rent collecting entity. So it was the letting agent. The premises owner didn't change. That's my understanding. Mrs. Sand, I was just confirming that the owner of the premises didn't change. It was the letting agent that was bought. Is that correct? Hinton Road Investment Limited is the rent collecting entity, so the letting agent and administrating entity within the group of companies. That is the entity that was purchased by the former leader, not the owner of the premises. Correct. now then there was a question in the press about whether or not there was anything inappropriate there. I think that the timing of it was it was not a councillor, and that's the question, but by a very slim margin. So just thinking through this, bear with me, what is the worst accusation we could make here? The worst accusation would be that what should have been done would have been declare that there were negotiations underway. Is that, so what are we talking about? What was, if anything was done wrong, what would it have been? And I think it's that declaring negotiations could have been made clear. Is that what we're talking about here?
So there's two things. There is the negotiate. If somebody doesn't buy a purchase on the day, they were actively a councillor in their term of office, and things were still, actively happening. But the question in 5.5 is, why was council space not utilised? So there's two questions there. So there's the accusation, if there is such an accusation, of was there any wrongdoing? Was there any inadvertent? Did somebody not understand that they were still a councillor? Should they have made declarations about what their plans were, that they had a potential conflict of interest? Should they have updated their register of interest? Probably not, because your register of interest wouldn't be updated until such time as you take ownership. But it doesn't change the 5.5, which was the question of the reason that Future Places took occupation.
No, thank you. That's helpful. And I think there's a number of different strands to this question around the rent. But I think part of the reason of going down this thought experiment is we're talking about what kind of level of concern might we have. And it seems to me this is a question of declaration, and whether or not it was done early enough. And I mean, my view is, as a previous councillor, there are no sanctions to not declaring from a previous council. So even if we were to be concerned about that, that's a previous councillor. Do you see where I'm coming from with that? Sorry, did you put your hand up first, Councillor Andrews?
Thank you for that. I'm looking at page 106. 5.57 says DM, that's Drew Mellor, agreed following the board meeting to look for potential alternative premises, and then move on about a month, 18th of June, hey presto, after extensive search, space has been found in Bourne House. Goodness me, there's quite a lot of empty offices in the middle of Bournemouth, empty shops, empty this, empty that. But hey, yes, I can see to some extent why serviced offices were tracked down, but there's an awful lot of serviced offices across Bournemouth, companies running this, but there's no mention in that report there. And this is the 18th of June, this went to the board meeting of Future Places, that Drew had lined up this acquisition to the extent that there was this conflict of interest, with Future Places. And move on, 18th of July board meeting, premises, bottom of page 106, it was confirmed that the premises have now been secured. And the acquisition was obviously delayed deliberately until the day after the elections, but not obviously the count didn't take place until the Friday. But clearly the paperwork for that acquisition would have been drafted out and put to one side and dated during the day.
I'm not sure that, Councillor Slade, I'm not sure.
Sorry, can I think there's a correction to be made there, Councillor Andrews. My understanding is, if you look at the timeline, 12th of May 2022, Drew Mellor to look at potential premises. And within a month, he's found some, June 2022. And by July 2022, they've been secured, which is wonderful. I've never known lawyers to move so fast. But the issue around the ownership is 2023, May 2023. He is not involved in the ownership of the company or the company that collects the rent or anything else at that point. It is a purchase, it is a rent, a lease of a premises. He then goes on to purchase. So I don't think what you've just said is correct, but what I do think is relevant is to then make a decision to go on and purchase and organize a shell company or whatever, a relationship with something which you have an interest in as the then leader of the council. There's a clearly that's a tangled web. But I think I just need to correct that.
Well, thank you for that correction. But obviously, he wasn't technically the lead. He wasn't actually the leader of the council leading up to the elections. He'd resigned that post back in February.
Mrs. Sanders, did you want to make a correction?
Yeah, the first part of what Councillor Slade said is absolutely correct, to just correct the timeline. I won't comment on the second bit that Councillor Slade did. And I also think it's somewhat unfair to characterise the move to Bourne House in the way that we have at the moment, because if you go back a page and you refer to 4.5, the Future Places Chief Operating Officer went through quite an extensive search in May for properties in Poole, including Beach House, including Carter's Quay, and several other options in Boscombe, Bournemouth and other places. So it's unclear from those notes whether Drew Miller was looking at those options as a director of the company then, or was he coming up with something of his own?
So I think to be clear, I don't see any evidence that the future decision to purchase Hinton Road, what's it called? Hinton Road Investment Limited. I don't see any evidence that influenced the decision of Future Places to move to those premises. And we're not suggesting that, we're not suggesting anything inappropriate about the choice of location for the offices at that point in time. I think when I asked about what's the worst we're talking about here, it's whether or not any declarations could have been made in the run up to the election that negotiations were happening. And I don't want to make a judgment here as to whether or not that is something. I mean, that would be a question for standards if a complaint had been made, but as an ex-councillor, it's not an option, and I think it would at most be a breach of the code of conduct, but even then, that is not for us to make a judgment on at all. Is that fair? Mr. Sanders, do you want to say anything on that? And I think that it's important to note for fairness that, oh, sorry, there was no sound when you said that. So I think, just for clarity, Mrs. Sanders just directed us all to paragraph 5.5.16, which just confirms that view that there was no pecuniary interest to declare, and it's up to the individual councillor of what to do. And I think it's important to be clear that no benefit was had from ownership of that organisation whilst being a councillor. I think that's fair to make clear as well. Councillor Tarling.
Yeah, thank you. I think the key thing here is the decision-making process, and we may never find out in that selection and who was key to that process, and we'd need minutes to see, and I don't think they exist. I haven't seen them in the report. Is that right? What informed the decision-making process to choose the Bourne space officers? That we don't have those records, and without that, we can't say that it wasn't a good commercial decision. With hindsight, again, we handfuls of hindsight here who say, well, we've got the annex, got all this free air, there's all this extra office space, and Councillor Andrews could have sold his services, selling some office space to future places, but that didn't happen, did it, Councillor Andrews? You can nod or shake your head. You didn't offer any land office space.
I'm not on the agency side, so I'm not aware what contact was made.
So-
But all I would say is there's an awful lot of accommodation back then on the market.
So, you know, we can throw accusations out here, and, you know, without the evidence, I think, you know, we're in very sticky ground. And again, I'm going to use the phrase I used earlier: to what end? You know, the former councillor is a former councillor. If he wishes to run again, he's not precluded to do so. But you know,
Yeah.
The Echo are here tonight reporting on it, and
So I think that's
continue to report on it.
why it's important to address what was in the press head on, because of the timing and you know the link to future places. But I don't see any reason to believe that that the future purchase influenced the decision where to locate. And I don't think we'll find out more than that. I think the second part of it is why they were not housed within this premises, and I think that's another kind of key part of this. Now, as I understand it, there is a difference of views between some of the individuals working for Future Places and the former chief executive, along the lines of they did have some office space here, but they wanted exclusive space for an area, whereas hot desking was the norm across this campus. And there was a tension there about whether or not Future Places staff could get a designated area that was just for them. And that was seen as kind of the reason for that. And you can see that was discussed at the board. At the Future Places board, it says dedicated space is not available, which is proving to be problematic, and it didn't suit their design model. So it says here that the former chief executive said, "You would do me a favour if you were to find your own offices." And I note the former chief executive says he doesn't recall using that phrase, but you can imagine a conversation around, well, we're not able to provide that designated space. And if that's clearly what the board wanted. So there's obviously a difference of opinion there as to whose instigation it was to not, and the reasons for not basing here. But you can see from the Future Places board that they believed meeting room capacity and number, drawing and design facilities, and other teams' confidentiality were listed as reasons to be problematic. So they had their commercial reasons for wanting a different space. And now, with hindsight, we might have said, well, it would have been cheaper to stay here, but they were entitled to make the decisions to where they were located as a Future Places board. Do you think that would be fair, Councillor Tarling?
I think that's fair.
Councillor Armstrong.
It's just to say really that just this conversation, particularly some of the points that you raised, Councillor Slade, are just making me think that perhaps, well, not really perhaps, but I think it's really important for the monitoring officer or for legal counsel to have sight of the report and to identify if there are any legal issues that need to be picked up or consequences that need, you know.
Thank you, Chair. And I think it's noteworthy that within the report, as Mr Stannard has stated, the monitoring officer or deputy was present, and there's no record of them citing any unlawfulness or, if you like, ringing the bell in terms of any distinct unlawfulness that the council may carry out, whether inadvertently or not. So I think it's fair to point that out because the monitoring officers aren't here who were here at the time. But as a monitoring officer, you have the ability ultimately to make a report, if you like, reports the council for unlawful activity. And I think Mr Stannard would agree, there's no suggestion that that took place. And so it would be reasonable to infer that the monitoring officer was aware and didn't consider there was illegality going on. That's different to whether things could have been done better, but there's a vast difference between the two. But I take the point, and it's something we can look at, but it would be very difficult to get inside the mind of a previous monitoring officer because not everything's written down for us, and we have to make judgments all the time. So, perhaps.
That's later.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reality is, this is very similar to a lot of the other conversations we've had tonight, which is, if you're looking at this from the perspective of an organisation that wants to be the organisation that the leadership at the time wanted to have and that the management of this organisation wanted to be, which was a completely independent, commercially focused organisation, you can see why every one of these decisions would have been taken. We're not looking at it from that perspective, because we're looking at it going, we've got an empty council building that could probably have been easily adapted if somebody was to have asked and to have negotiated, spending money that we're looking at from a taxpayer point of view and a council point of view, and therefore none of these actions, I would suggest, would have taken place if this organisation had been set up in a different way, going all the way back to our conversation at the last meeting, not as a URC or whatever, it was a UTC or this type of organisation. Therefore, it's very difficult because none of these things are wrong, illegal, or immoral. They're just not what we would expect for an organisation involved with a council. And that's why I think we're struggling with this, because we're looking at it from a different perspective than the board was looking at it. So, I think it's absolutely right. There's perfectly legitimate for them to go off and spend 50-odd thousand pounds on rent if they so wish to. Whether it was appropriate to use money that was being borrowed from the council to do that, we would say no, but they had passed a resolution in the council that gave them permission to do this. Therefore, we're sort of a bit stuck.
Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, Mr. Sanad.
Sorry if it's repeating a little bit of that, but the sort of cultural difference, I guess, is that, and why I believe the shareholder representative took the line he took was, most council departments could say they need confidential space. Children's social care can manage to work in an open plan office and book meeting rooms when they need it, and that was the model that was available to Future Places, and they said that didn't work for them.
And I mean, if you're trying to create a kind of flashy competitor in the private regeneration consultancy workspace, you don't go from a exciting conference somewhere and come back to the annex over here. It's not part of the vision and the purpose and the ethos for it, even despite what we might think. Okay, so that's another strand of that. Nice. Sorry. So then the other strand to this is right, the payment of the rent at the time of the break clause. Now this is a contentious issue. Now to just make sure that my understanding is correct, the Chief Operating Officer was signed that negotiated that there could be a break clause. There was a 6-month break clause that would be beneficial to the council. Exercising the break clause would save Future Places and the public purse 27 grand minimum. So he obviously thought that was useful to do, but the understanding was that to be able to exercise the break clause, the rent had to be paid. The Chief Operating Officer had signed that the rent was to be paid through the portal, but then was on holiday. And there's a question over the fact that the board then decided, while he was on holiday, to go ahead and enact that rent payment so that break clause would be an option. And there's a question there about that process. And to be specific, a whistleblowing disclosure was made that essentially that rent payment should not have been made. And I think the report is very thorough on this and the reasons why it was deemed not to meet the Public Interest Disclosure Act criteria, because there wasn't a failure to follow a legal obligation. It was paying rent, which was indeed due. That the board took the decision. The correct legal entity was paid, and the chief executive, the chief operating officer signed the agreement that the payment was made. So I don't have any further questions on that item, but I think it's worth noting that there was discontent with that, the decision to pay that rent. But Future Places Board made the decision to pay the rent in the belief that it would enable the break clause to be enacted. Is that correct, as I've characterised it? Councillor Andrews.
Quickly, break clauses, very common in business leases nowadays. Break clauses have conditions. One condition, which still remains, is a notice period, 6 months normally. Historic break clauses had lots and lots and lots of conditions. And I've read the report, yes, one condition which has caught a lot of people up in effectively an invalid break notice is there are arrears of rent. And there was one classic case whereby it was all rents, service charge rent, and the landlord hadn't even billed for the service charge rent. Nobody actually knew what on earth it was because it hadn't been calculated. But because they owed that service charge rent, the notice was invalid. So paying the first reserve rent, the rent on the building, and of course it was an inclusive rent, there were no other charges, we know that, was fundamental in getting the lease ended and saving the public purse £27,000.
Did anyone want to say anything further on that item? I think it's worth making clear to the public that the police received a third-party referral about that matter of the purchase by the former, and the referral was closed without any further action necessary. So do any members remaining think that there was anything further to explore on this? I think there might be value in asking some of the individuals concerned for their, their perspective. But I don't see any evidence of anything more sinister or more serious or more concerning. Councillor Armstrong.
I hear you, but we haven't interviewed anybody who was involved with this particular issue, so we can't say one way or the other, really. And I think in terms of giving assurance that there wasn't any wrongdoing, intentional or otherwise, we can't make that judgment.
Can I ask which area of it that you think that
I think
so many strands to it?
In terms of the whole, the whole part of this.
Let's make an item to try and distill that into some specific kind of lines of inquiry, and we can talk about that at the next meeting. I think that there's three aspects to it as far as I can see. One is the choice of rent premises. Do we think there was any wrongdoing there? I can't see what possible wrongdoing there could be. I wouldn't even know how you would find out if there's possible wrongdoing there. The second is in whether or not negotiations about purchasing Hinton Road Investments Limited should have been declared by Drumella. Again, because of the 28 days notice for declaring something, I think we can ask his view on what happened and what point he was aware of that. But I don't see where that, I don't see what wrongdoing there could be there. And then the third aspect of it is whether or not it was inappropriate to pay the rent that was due. And again, I don't see that. I don't see where it could go. So I think we should have a conversation about it. And if you're concerned that there are still areas to explore, I think we should think about that. But I think it would, because of the different strands to it, I think we should be specific about what sort of wrongdoing we're looking to explore. Does that make sense, Councillor Armstrong?
Yes, but there was also a whistleblowing, and I'm starting to feel really tired. I know, Mr. Sennard, that was reviewed by yourself, the whistleblowing allegation or whatever, however you describe it. I'm not sure. I'm not very clear on why that was disallowed.
So it's not disallowed, as in line with the council's whistleblowing policy. There's a process, and you have to there's an assessment made as to whether or not it's considered as a judgment made as to whether it meets the criteria for what counts as a PIDA disclosure set out in the relevant law. I think that and section 5.5.33 is where Mr. Sanad sets out the grounds on which he determined that there was no failure to follow a legal obligation, because that's the criteria. One of the criteria is whether the legal obligation was followed, and that section sets out the grounds on which. Now, PIDA disclosures and the judgments are always judgments unless it goes to a court. So unless that is taken to a court as per, it goes to a judge, there isn't a final decision on it, and that's obviously not something that we can do. So I think what's relevant for that is to note that there are following steps in the whistleblowing procedure. So if you don't agree with the judgment made, then there's a process you can follow for the next steps. If you think that was not, you disagree with that judgment, and that wasn't followed. I'm concerned about what we are able to do as a committee separate to that whistleblowing process. So I think we can return to that as an area to if you want to get more clarity on that, that might be something. It might also be useful to talk to Mr. Sana directly about how that process usually works, and you can see the decision record. But as far as I'm aware, nobody has questioned that judgment. That there's been no kind of, by the individual involved, there hasn't been any, as far as I'm aware, accusation that was the incorrect judgment. So let's take that away to look into more, because I think it is very important. But that's my understanding. Did you want to add to that?
For complete transparency, the individual has said it was the wrong judgment, but has not taken any action further. But you would think it was if you've made what you think is a whistleblowing disclosure and then somebody says it's not, you're going to disagree, aren't you? So, but the acid test is, okay, you disagree, there are routes to challenge that, and those routes weren't taken.
Yeah, to be clear, from my perspective,
I can go through, Councillor Armstrong, I can go through the whistleblowing, as you said, Councillor Connolly, and some are obvious, like, there's 6 characteristics to whistleblowing. Is it a danger to health and safety? Is it a danger to the environment? We can quickly cross them out, because of course this is nothing to do with the health and safety or the environment. And the only one it could possibly touch was, and is it what was the correct phrase again? Legal obligation. A failure to follow a legal obligation. So that's the one I had to consider whether it was or it wasn't. And obviously the layout at 5.533 highlights why I believed it wasn't a failure to follow a legal obligation.
Sorry, to clarify, when I said the individual obviously wouldn't be happy with the judgment, but then did not take the steps following that. That's what I meant to say. And from my perspective, I think that the reasons set out in 5.5.33 are convincing that there was not a failure to follow a legal obligation, because ultimately the rent was due. I don't see how it could be inappropriate to pay the rent that was due, and Future Places Board made that decision to pay the rent, and the coup had said that it had previously authorised it already. So I am satisfied with that rationale, but if others want to make a note of that as an issue to pursue further, that is definitely something that can be discussed. And perhaps you can bilaterally talk about about that process and go from there. Right. I think it's been a long session. We're at 5.6. Should we call it a day there? And then hopefully, I think that doesn't leave too much remaining of this section. So we're not far behind where we hope to be. Does that have agreement with others? Agreed. Oh, right. And with that in mind, please do email me between now and as soon as possible, but before the next meeting, with your particular questions or areas of interest, and I will compile them together so we have a working document to discuss for the next meeting. I'm happy to talk about it separately as well. Right, with that, thank you very much, everyone. Good evening.